A small boy runs across the shingle, his laughter swallowed by the sea wind. When he stumbles, his mother thinks he's tripped on driftwood, but beneath the stones lies a human foot, pale and rigid beneath a thin veil of sand. The discovery will silence the bandstand music of Eastbourne and mark the beginning of one of Britain's most haunting seaside murders. You're listening to Morbid Milestones. Tell me where and when you're joining us tonight, and remember to subscribe before we begin. The afternoon of Friday, 20th August 1920, was clear and still along the Sussex coast. A soft wind moved across the dunes near Eastbourne, lifting the scent of salt and dry grass. Families holidaying from London wandered the promenade, while children built small fortresses of sand and shell. The war had ended 2 years earlier, and England was still trying to remember what peace was supposed to sound like. At the far edge of the town, where the resort thins into quiet wasteland, lay a stretch of uneven shoreline known as the Crumbles. It was neither beach nor field, but a ragged borderland of grass, flint, and broken shingle, flat, exposed, and nearly empty, except for the occasional fisherman or railway worker taking a shortcut home. It was here, just after midday, that a small boy chasing his ball saw something protruding from the stones. At first, it looked like a sandbag, but as his mother reached down to brush the grit away, she froze. What emerged was the pale curve of a human ankle, still wearing a black stocking. She screamed, and the cry carried across the open air until a passerby came running. The police were called, and within the hour the sound of digging and the clatter of shovels broke the stillness that had lingered over the Crumbles for centuries. When the Eastbourne police arrived, led by local constables and later joined by a medical officer, the body was already attracting a small crowd. The Seaside had its share of drownings, but this was different. The corpse was fully clothed, lying face down beneath 2 inches of shingle, as though deliberately hidden but not buried deeply enough to escape discovery. Nearby lay a large stone, heavy and dark with blood. Dr. Ernest Cadman, summoned from Eastbourne, examined the scene in fading daylight. The sun was sinking toward Pevensey Bay, and the waves had begun to flatten under the red haze of evening. He recorded what he could by lamplight. A young woman, about 17 years of age, well dressed in a green wool coat trimmed with imitation fur. Her black hat had been pulled down over her face, and one glove remained on her left hand. Cadman's first impression was of violence, sudden and deliberate. There were wounds to the right side of the head, severe enough to fracture the skull, and several teeth were scattered among the stones. The woman's small handbag was missing. He noted the faint scent of perfume beneath the tang of salt and decay, an echo of the life that had ended only hours before. The doctor estimated that she had been dead between 12 and 24 hours. There were no signs of drowning or sexual assault. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, most likely delivered by the nearby stone. He ordered that the body be moved to the local mortuary, where it could be examined in better light the next morning. By nightfall, the town was murmuring with speculation. Tourists at the boarding houses spoke in hushed voices. Hotel owners asked whether it was safe for ladies to walk alone. The next morning's Eastbourne Chronicle printed a brief notice. Unidentified young woman found dead on the Crumbles. Police investigating. No name, no photograph, only a place, and a mystery that had already drawn the attention of Scotland Yard. When Chief Inspector George Mercer arrived from London, he found a town struggling to balance curiosity with propriety. Eastbourne was a resort of middling respectability, neither as fashionable as Brighton nor as rowdy as Hastings. It attracted clerks, governesses, and small merchants escaping the capital's heat. Its civic pride lay in cleanliness and order. A murder here felt almost indecent, as though the crime itself had committed a breach of manners. Mercer ordered a detailed search of the surrounding area. Constables combed the dunes for footprints, cigarette ends, or torn fabric. Nothing useful appeared except for a small paper bag, crumpled and half full of boiled sweets. It was sticky with blood and sand, and it had been stuffed hastily into the dead girl's coat pocket. Inside the mortuary, Dr. James Adams, the police surgeon, performed a full post-mortem. His report was clinical, but unsettling. The injuries were consistent with at least 2 blows from a heavy, blunt object, perhaps a large stone or a weighted stick. The face was so damaged that initial identification seemed unlikely. Yet the rest of her appearance suggested she had not been destitute. Her stockings were fine quality, her underclothing clean and new. On one finger, she wore a modest ring of rolled gold. As the doctors worked, Mercer directed his men to the nearby lodging houses, showing the victim's clothing and asking if anyone recognized her. Among the first to respond was Mrs. Winiat, who kept rooms at 393 Seaside Road. She told the officers she had recently taken in a young woman named Miss Munro, quiet and polite, who had gone out for a walk 2 days earlier and had not returned. Mercer brought her to the mortuary that afternoon. The air was thick with formalin. When the sheet was lifted, Mrs. Winiat hesitated. The features were distorted, but she recognized the green coat, the neat hem she had noticed when her tenant first unpacked. With trembling hands, she confirmed the identity. Irene Violet Munro, age 17, typist from London. News traveled fast. By evening, reporters from the Daily Mirror and Sunday Pictorial were already at the police station, sketching headlines and searching for photographs. Eastbourne, once proud of its tranquility, found itself at the center of national attention. Yet beyond the sensational curiosity, the tragedy exposed deeper questions about the vulnerability of young women traveling alone, about the casual dangers of trust, and about the fragile line between propriety and risk in the new decade. When Flora Munro arrived from London 2 days later, she moved through the station in silence. The constables fell quiet as she entered the room where her daughter's body lay. Flora had raised Irene alone, working long hours as a domestic servant. Now she stood beside the table, her hands clasped, staring at what little remained of her child's face. She did not cry until she saw the green coat. Outside, the wind shifted inland, carrying the smell of salt and oil from the pier. Eastbourne's holiday season was nearly over. The Crumbles lay empty again, the shingle smooth as if nothing had happened. But a mark remained, a sense that innocence, once disturbed, could never be restored. Somewhere in that loneliness lay the question that would haunt the months to come. Who had walked with Irene Munro into the stones, and why had she trusted them? The investigation began with her name, but the story of Irene Violet Munro stretched far beyond the narrow confines of a police file. It reached back through the industrial suburbs of Brighton to the rented rooms and servant corridors that defined working-class life on England's southern coast at the turn of the century. Understanding Irene's end meant first understanding the quiet limitations that shaped her beginning. She was born on 23 November 1902, when Brighton was a place of faded grandeur. The once fashionable seaside resort had become a mosaic of contrasts, elegant crescents for the wealthy above and damp terraces for those who served them below. Irene's mother, Flora Munro, was a domestic servant, one of thousands of women who scrubbed floors and polished banisters for families whose names never entered history. Her wages barely kept her housed, and like many in service, she had little privacy and less freedom. Irene's birth certificate named no father. Flora later told friends that he was a coal merchant named William, already dead by the time his daughter was old enough to ask his name. Whether this was truth or discretion is unclear. For a woman alone in Edwardian Britain, respectability was a fragile currency. To have a child out of wedlock meant social exile, and Flora learned to speak carefully about her past. By the time Irene was 9, her mother's long hours left little space for childcare. The girl was sent to live with a foster family in nearby Hove, a quieter suburb just west of Brighton. It was not an uncommon arrangement. Many working women, especially in domestic service, placed their children temporarily in the care of others. Irene's new home offered stability, if not affection, and she grew into a quiet, observant child. Her teachers at the East Hove higher grade girls' school described her as intelligent, diligent, and reserved. She excelled in writing and arithmetic and showed a gift for concentration unusual for her age. In the classrooms filled with the smell of chalk and ink, Irene found something close to pride. For a few years, learning replaced the affection she rarely received. But education for working-class girls had limits. Academic success often led not to university, but to a typewriter. By her mid-teens, Irene's letters to her mother were brief and practical. Polite inquiries about work, about money, about when she might visit. The war was still burning across Europe, and Brighton, like the rest of the country, lived with its echo. Soldiers on leave crowded the promenades, and wounded men filled the temporary hospitals along the seafront. For a girl growing up among such contradictions, gaiety beside loss, hope beside fatigue, adulthood must have seemed both thrilling and dangerous. Around 1917, as munitions factories expanded and women were drawn into new roles, Flora took a position as housekeeper in London, serving a wealthy couple in South Kensington. She moved into a tall townhouse with high ceilings and polished stair rails, the kind of place where a servant's life was invisible except in its results. Irene soon joined her there, moving from the Sussex coast to the capital. The city offered possibilities, but also a certain moral exposure. In London, Irene worked briefly as a shorthand typist for a luxury shoemaker on Regent Street. It was a position of modest independence, enough income to buy her own clothes, to send a small allowance to her mother, and to walk unchaperoned along the bright shop fronts of the West End. She earned just under £3 a week, a decent wage for her class, and sent nearly half home. The rest she spent on small pleasures, cinema tickets, cheap theater seats, and evenings at cafes with her friend Ada Beasley, a cheerful young woman who shared her taste for adventure. London in the late 1910s was a city shedding its old skin. The suffrage movement had left a visible mark, and though most women still faced economic limits, they now walked the streets with a confidence their mothers could not imagine. Skirts shortened, hair was bobbed, and the idea of a young woman dining unescorted no longer drew scandalous stares, at least not in the newer parts of the city. Yet this new freedom came with its own dangers. Men returning from the trenches and the colonies carried with them an unease that peace could not cure. They were older, often damaged, and looked upon women like Irene, youthful, lively, unguarded, as symbols of a world that had moved on without them. Among these men was Ludwig Kort, a Belgian import-export manager who met Irene in early 1920. He was 45, twice her age, and well-dressed. He dined in respectable restaurants and wrote letters in elaborate cursive. For a girl of 17 working in a city where attention could be both flattering and perilous, his manner must have seemed worldly. Ludwig took her to Hampton Court Palace, bought her gifts, and sent her affectionate notes signed, "Your little bird." His language carried a hint of ownership disguised as care, a tone common to men who believed affection justified authority. Flora found one of his letters by accident and confronted her daughter. It included a £1 note and advice to buy cream for her pretty face. To Flora, raised in the late Victorian moral code, such intimacy between a man and her unmarried daughter was improper at best, corrupt at worst. She urged Irene to return the money and end the acquaintance. Irene refused. Her diary from that spring shows the conflict with painful clarity. "Some mothers," she wrote, "think we are going to be kidnapped or something." In another line, she added, "I do so want to grow up quickly. Life is too short, and I'm going to make the best of it." These sentences, still girlish in tone, carry an unspoken plea for experience, for recognition, for something beyond the narrow respectability of her upbringing. By March 1920, Ludwig proposed marriage. Irene declined politely, citing the age difference. What she did not know was that he was already married, with 3 children in Belgium. Instead, she grew close to another man, John Maxwell, her employer at an accountancy firm. Maxwell was married too. Their lunches at the Golden Cross Hotel became a secret of the office, whispered about but never proven. He would later admit to kissing her when the staff were away. For the first time, Irene seemed torn between innocence and rebellion. She was neither reckless nor naive. She simply wanted to choose her own company. But society did not easily forgive such choices in young women, especially those without wealth to protect their reputations. Every decision she made would later be reinterpreted through the lens of judgment, as if the act of living freely had invited her death. That summer, Flora planned a holiday to Edinburgh, one of the few luxuries her savings allowed. She asked Irene to come with her. The daughter declined. She wanted the sea, but not Scotland's cold cliffs. She wanted warmth and sunlight and perhaps companionship. After leafing through guidebooks, she chose Eastbourne, a coastal town just far enough from London to feel like another world. The guide described bracing air, excellent bathing, and refined company. It also mentioned the Crumbles, a long, untamed stretch of beach between Eastbourne and Pevensey Bay. The words promised solitude and beauty. They gave no warning of danger. Irene packed her suitcase carefully. Inside were a few dresses, a hat, a notebook, and the green wool coat she had saved months to buy. She placed £7 in her purse and a handful of postcards for friends. Early one August morning, she left her mother's lodging and boarded the train from London. As the carriages rolled southward, past the pale chalk of the downs, she might have imagined the week ahead. Sunlight, sea breeze, perhaps a dance or two. Her diary entries ended abruptly that month, mid-sentence, as if the page itself had turned away. By the time the train reached Eastbourne, the gulls were already circling above the promenade. Irene stepped out into the morning light, unknowing that her journey, like the summer of 1920 itself, would never be completed. The train that carried Irene into Eastbourne that summer morning was the same sort that had once brought her as a child from Brighton to Hove, years before the war. The rhythm of wheels and steel was a sound she had known since girlhood, the faint promise that movement itself might mean progress. Yet even in childhood, progress for girls like Irene meant something narrower than freedom. To understand the decisions she made as a young woman, one must look back to the education that shaped her and to the atmosphere of those years when duty and discipline were considered virtues greater than happiness. Irene attended the East Hove Higher Grade Girls' School, one of several municipal schools built after the Education Acts of the late 19th century. These schools offered working-class children a disciplined form of learning, designed less to expand their imagination than to prepare them for employment. Her teachers were unmarried women in long skirts who believed in moral order. Each day began with hymns, continued with copybooks and geography recitations, and ended with sewing or bookkeeping practice. For Irene, there was comfort in this predictability. She was quiet, precise, and adaptable, a pupil who followed rules even when they felt invisible. But quietness had its cost. Other girls, children of tradesmen or artisans, formed little circles of laughter that never quite opened for her. There are no surviving letters from those years, but witnesses later described her as self-contained, one of those children who seemed older than her age. It was not arrogance, it was caution, the natural defense of someone already aware that she did not quite belong. At home, if her foster placement could be called that, there was order without affection. The family who took her in were respectable people who believed that work built character. Irene helped with house chores and read by lamplight. It was a quiet life, unremarkable to outsiders but heavy in its silence. Many children in foster care at the time were treated with civility rather than warmth. They were not quite servants, but not entirely sons or daughters either. In such an environment, a child learned to observe rather than to ask. Irene's later shyness, her tendency to listen before she spoke, and her longing for independence all grew from these early absences. For girls like her, education was not a ladder to freedom, but a rehearsal for obedience. Yet there were small glimpses of imagination, school plays, walks by the sea, and books borrowed from teachers' private shelves. During the years before the war, Brighton and Hove were changing. The electric trams clattered down the seafront, and the pier lights glowed against the Channel winds. Servants in stiff uniforms hurried through service doors, while their employers danced in the music halls. Class lines, though still rigid, began to blur slightly as tourism brought outsiders and money into the towns. Irene grew up watching that contrast, luxury on one side of the street, struggle on the other, and learned that charm and appearance could sometimes bridge the gap, even if only for an evening. When 1914 arrived and Britain went to war, the rhythm of life shifted overnight. The men left and the women worked. Brighton's hotels became hospitals, and Hove's schools held sewing drives for soldiers' uniforms. Irene, 12 at the time, would have seen the uniforms everywhere, khaki mixed with black mourning veils. She watched trains of wounded men arriving at the station, saw the nurses in white aprons, and heard stories whispered about the front. Childhood ended quickly in those years. By 1917, her foster arrangement had grown strained. Flora was working in London by then, and the letters between mother and daughter were infrequent. But Irene had begun to show a kind of self-possession unusual for a girl of her background. Her teachers recommended her for shorthand and typing classes, the new route for ambitious girls who wanted to escape domestic service. Typewriters, though mechanical, carried a strange sense of liberation. Each keystroke was a small claim on the modern world. It was probably around this time that Irene began to dream of London. The capital had always represented both danger and possibility to provincial minds. For servants and factory girls, it was the place where anonymity could become opportunity, where accent and birthplace mattered less than appearance and charm. Her mother's letters described the households of South Kensington, the polished silver, the narrow servant stairs, the polite distance between classes. Irene likely read these lines with both admiration and dread. She knew how hard Flora worked and how little it earned her. When the war ended in 1918, victory brought little relief. Prices rose, jobs were scarce, and rationing lingered. Brighton's beach filled again with visitors, but its poorer quarters, Kemptown, Hanover, the North Lane, remained weary. Widows and war pensioners occupied the boarding houses. The cheerful posters advertising fresh sea air seemed almost ironic. Irene, nearing 16, had lived her entire conscious life under the shadow of national conflict. Peace, when it came, was as uncertain as war. So when Flora sent for her, offering a room in the London house where she worked, Irene must have felt both gratitude and anxiety. London was not only a change of scenery, it was a transformation. It meant exchanging the predictability of Hove's classrooms for the anonymity of the capital, the hum of carriages and electric lights, the crowds moving through Regent Street, where new fashions replaced the old every season. The move itself, by train once again, marked a private milestone. In her small suitcase were modest clothes and a few books, but no photographs of her father, no souvenirs from childhood. The journey from the coast to the capital mirrored a social migration happening all across Britain. The movement of working-class daughters from household service to office work. Typing and clerical labor had become the new form of respectability, cleaner, more modern, and less dependent on obedience to a single employer. For Irene, this shift was more than economic. It was psychological. Office life brought exposure to conversation, to fashion, to the faint illusion of equality among men and women sharing the same desks. In Regent Street, she would learn the subtler hierarchies of tone and gesture that divided clerks from managers and ladies from girls. This new world also carried temptations. Cafes served coffee late into the evening. Picture palaces flickered with American romances. Magazines sold the idea that happiness could be achieved through charm and self-possession. It was easy to believe that a clever girl might ascend by her wit alone. Yet beneath that surface, optimism lay the same rigid social structure her mother had known, only disguised in modern clothes. Irene adapted quickly, but she remained cautious. Friends later remembered her as intelligent but not assertive, elegant yet modest. She was the sort of young woman who might appear aloof until she smiled. The war had changed men more than women. The young clerks and veterans who filled the city's cafes often sought companionship without commitment. Irene's discretion protected her from scandal for a time, but it also made her invisible to the kind of respect she deserved. Her loneliness was not unique. A generation of young women now lived in small rented rooms, earning their own wages, sending money to their mothers, and wondering what kind of freedom they had really achieved. They walked to work through streets that promised everything and delivered very little. They read advice columns warning them not to trust strange men, even as advertisements encouraged them to be sociable and modern. It was a paradox that defined post-war femininity. Independence framed by constant caution. In this world of divided expectations, Irene Munro learned to balance obedience and curiosity. The discipline of her school years, the quiet endurance of her childhood, and the polished manners of her mother's class all formed the mask she wore in London. Beneath it, however, was a simple wish, to be seen not as a servant's daughter, but as herself. That wish would carry her far from the classrooms of Hove and into the glittering uncertainty of the capital, where her intelligence and beauty caught the attention of men who promised admiration but delivered only danger. The choices born in those early lessons of loneliness would follow her to the end, to a quiet seaside lodging house, a summer holiday, and a patch of stones where laughter once drifted on the wind. When Irene stepped off the train at Victoria Station, the air itself seemed different. The sea wind of Brighton was gone, replaced by the heavy scent of coal smoke and wet stone. London in 1919 was a city still recovering from the strain of war, streets patched, buildings stained, and men limping home from a conflict that had redrawn the map of the world. Yet for the young, the capital carried the shimmer of a promise, not safety, but possibility. Her mother, Flora Munro, was waiting on the platform, dressed neatly in the subdued colors of service. For years they had lived apart, writing brief letters filled more with duty than affection. Their reunion must have felt cautious, as if mother and daughter were meeting not as family, but as two women of different worlds. One shaped by the restraint of the Victorian household, the other by the restless modern city. They walked to a small flat off Cromwell Road, where Flora worked as housekeeper for a wealthy couple. The family occupied the upper floors, leaving the servants a pair of narrow rooms below the kitchen. The ceilings were low, the air close, but there was a kind of pride in the order. Flora's hands bore the proof of her years in service, calloused, red from soap, steady. She spoke little that night. Irene unpacked in silence, aware that she was now an adult, a paying lodger in her mother's care. The London Irene entered was a city of contrasts. Horse-drawn cabs still shared the streets with motor cars. Theaters glittered in the West End while veterans begged at the curbs. Shops along Regent Street offered perfumes, gloves, and new styles of women's hats. Advertisements called these years the age of progress, but progress came unevenly. The same society that welcomed women into the workforce also judged them for wanting independence. Irene found her first employment through a friend of her mother's, a fellow servant whose brother managed a small office. It was a shorthand typist's post at a shoemaking firm catering to wealthy clients, a position modest in title but secure. The office occupied 2 rooms above a shop front, and each morning she walked there in her green coat, the hum of traffic replacing the sound of waves she had grown up with. Her wages, £2, 7 shillings and 6 pence a week, left little for extravagance, but she managed with precision, a few shillings for rent, a few for meals, and 13 sent faithfully home to her mother each week. With what remained, she bought small comforts, a new blouse, a trip to the cinema, a penny novel from a street vendor. She was learning how to balance respectability and desire, the delicate arithmetic of survival. It was during those early months that she became close to Ada Beasley, another typist from the office. Ada, known to her friends as Ada, was lively, talkative, and worldly. She had grown up in London and understood its codes. where to eat cheaply, how to avoid unwanted attention, which parts of the city were safe after dark. Through Ada, Irene learned the rhythm of urban life. Tea shops, dance halls, and the thrill of payday evenings when girls could briefly forget their fatigue. But Irene was not careless. Her letters and diary fragments reveal a steady mind, a quiet wish to enjoy the new freedoms without stepping beyond propriety. She wrote that London is full of light and loneliness both at once. It is a simple line, but it captures the paradox of the post-war years, a generation reaching for joy while still haunted by loss. By 1919, the country was changing. The Representation of the People Act had given partial voting rights to women, and newspapers filled with discussions of equality and morality. Yet the divide between classes remained immense. Servants were leaving domestic work for factories and offices, but their speech, manners, and dress still marked them. For Irene, the transition from servant's daughter to typist was a social ascent, but a fragile one. Her success depended on maintaining the appearance of respectability, something that could be shattered by a single rumor. Her office overlooked a narrow lane where carriages still passed. It was there that she first noticed the older man who sometimes waited outside, Ludwig Kort, a Belgian businessman who managed an import-export firm nearby. He was neatly dressed, with polished shoes and a gold watch chain. When he began greeting her in the mornings, she felt a mixture of flattery and caution. Older men often spoke to working girls, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. Ludwig's attentions were persistent but courteous. He invited her to lunch, sent her small notes written in careful English, and spoke of travel. Antwerp, Brussels, Paris. The world he described must have felt impossibly distant from the narrow streets of South Kensington. For a girl whose life had been confined to schoolrooms and rented rooms, the promise of cosmopolitan elegance carried its own quiet spell. In one surviving letter, Ludwig called her "my little bird" and enclosed a pound note asking her to buy cream for her skin. The gesture, innocent in his mind perhaps, carried an intimacy that alarmed her mother when she found it. Flora, still governed by the codes of the previous century, saw moral danger where Irene saw curiosity. She warned her daughter sternly, urging her to return the gift and cut contact. Irene ignored her. She wrote in her diary that, "Some mothers think we shall be kidnapped." The tone is half amusement, half rebellion, the kind of mild defiance that signals the growing distance between generations. But beneath that defiance was also a longing for recognition. She wanted to be treated as an adult, capable of her own choices, and the modern city seemed to promise that independence, even as it quietly punished those who reached for it. Ludwig's interest soon turned serious. He proposed marriage in April 1920, declaring his admiration and his intention to make her happy forever. She declined gently but firmly, saying he was too old. What she did not know was that he already had a wife and 3 children in Belgium. When investigators later uncovered this detail, it would add a faint bitterness to her story. One more example of how easily sincerity could be used as disguise. After ending the friendship with Ludwig, Irene turned her attention to her work. She changed positions, taking a typist's job at an accountancy firm, where she earned a little more and met John Maxwell, her new employer. Maxwell was younger than Kort, but still married, a man accustomed to being admired by the women who worked for him. Their professional relationship soon blurred. They took lunch together at the Golden Cross Hotel, exchanged small gifts, and found privacy in the office when others were away. Later, he admitted to kissing her frequently, though he denied anything further. These encounters might seem mild by modern standards, but for a 17-year-old typist in 1920, they carried risk. Respectability was still a form of armor. To lose it was to lose everything: job, reputation, even safety. Yet for Irene, who had spent her youth surrounded by rules and restraint, these experiences may have felt like part of growing up, her own hesitant claim on adulthood. The year was shifting towards summer, and with it came the longing for escape. Factories closed for a week, clerks were granted short holidays, and the railways filled with travelers seeking sea air. Flora planned a trip north to Scotland, urging her daughter to join her. But Irene, perhaps weary of her mother's supervision, chose differently. She longed for freedom, for a holiday of her own making. She spent evenings studying guidebooks, tracing with her finger the thin blue lines of the Sussex coast. The name Eastbourne caught her attention. Gentler than Brighton, quieter than Hastings, respectable yet lively. The description spoke of promenades, gardens, and excellent bathing. She packed her suitcase with care. 2 dresses, a hat, her notebook, and that green coat trimmed with imitation fur. 7 pounds in cash, enough for a week of modest comfort. As she boarded the early train from London, the first light of August lay soft over the city rooftops. Irene may have felt that familiar thrill she'd known since childhood, the hum of wheels, the sense of departure. Behind her lay the endless calculations of city life, the unspoken judgments, the office chatter. Ahead lay the open sea. She believed she was traveling toward rest. She was, in truth, traveling toward the edge of a story that would outlive her. By the spring of 1920, Irene's world had narrowed to the size of her desk. The window of the accountancy office looked onto Regent Street, where trams clattered by in rhythm with the ticking of the typewriters. Her hands moved quickly, precisely. She copied columns of figures, wrote dictated letters, and filed receipts in the narrow drawers that smelled faintly of ink and glue. For most young women in her position, life passed in this quiet machinery of routine, respectable, predictable, and unremarked. Yet beneath the order lay an unease, the awareness that youth was slipping away while the future remained uncertain. Her diary from those months, fragmentary but revealing, offers glimpses of that restlessness. She wrote of wanting to see more, to meet people who lived differently, and of her conviction that life is meant to be a little daring. To anyone else, the phrase might have sounded trivial, but to a 17-year-old typist earning less than £3 a week, it was an act of modest rebellion. She was tired of caution. The war had ended. The world was supposedly new. She wanted her share of it. Ludwig Court had not vanished entirely. Though she declined his proposal, his letters continued, gentle in tone but edged with possession. He wrote about missing her company, about their lunches, about how a young lady such as you should not be working so hard. He enclosed another note of money, a gesture that would later seem more ominous than kind. Irene accepted it at first, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps curiosity, but she hid the envelope from her mother. Flora Munro still lived by the rules of service. In her world, appearances meant survival. She pressed her daughter to be careful, to avoid gossip, to remember that a good name was all a woman truly owned. The caution was sincere, but it came wrapped in fear. Flora had known what it meant to lose security, to be judged by employers, to live at the mercy of others' opinions. Irene respected her, but she could not live entirely under those shadows. In early May, the correspondence with Ludwig became more sentimental. One letter, later read aloud in court, began with the words, "My dear little bird." It continued in a tone of rehearsed intimacy, describing her beauty, her quietness, and the pleasure he took in walking beside her. "Do not tell your friend Ada what we intend to do in the future," he wrote. "It is so much nicer to be alone with you." He ended by sending her a £1 note and a suggestion to buy face cream to render your pretty face clean and bright. The line would echo later, quoted by journalists with both fascination and disdain, as if to confirm that Irene's tragedy had begun not with violence, but with vanity. In truth, it revealed something simpler: the imbalance of power between an experienced man and a girl still learning to interpret the language of attention. When Flora found the letter, her reaction was swift. She confronted her daughter, demanding to know whether the man intended marriage. Irene brushed her off, insisting that it was nothing. The argument that followed was ordinary enough, the kind that had unfolded between mothers and daughters for centuries. Yet within its silence lay the seeds of catastrophe. Flora's warnings carried the moral weight of the past. Irene's defiance carried the impatience of the present. Neither could reach the other. After the quarrel, Irene wrote again in her diary, "Some people think me quiet, some noisy, some clever, some ignorant. And after all, what am I? Just an ordinary girl whom everyone misunderstands." The entry continues, "I do so want to grow up quickly. Life is too short, and I'm going to enjoy myself and make the best of it." The words are simple, yet almost prophetic. To grow up quickly in that era meant walking without guidance. Freedom came without safety nets. The late Victorian guardians of morality had spent decades warning women against impropriety, but they had never taught them how to survive freedom itself. As the months passed, Irene's relationship with Ludwig faded. His letters grew infrequent, his tone impatient. He spoke of business in Belgium, of possible travel. She began avoiding him. Around the same time, she grew close to John Maxwell, the head clerk at her new office. He was in his early 30s, married, and carried himself with the self-assurance of a man who enjoyed being admired. For a while, he and Irene took lunch together at the Golden Cross Hotel, a modest establishment known for its discreet clientele. Later, he told police that he had kissed her several times when the office was empty. Whether affection or convenience drew her to him is impossible to say. Perhaps she found in Maxwell what she had once imagined in Ludwig, attention without the pretense of guardianship. He treated her as a companion rather than a child, yet this too placed her in danger, not of physical harm, but of social judgment. The 1920s had begun, but morality had not yet caught up with modernity. A working girl seen dining with a married man could be ruined by gossip alone. In that sense, Irene's story was never merely personal. It reflected the tension of an entire generation. Young women suspended between old rules and new desires, walking the narrow line between respectability and ruin. The newspapers of the time were filled with articles about modern girls, described alternately as emancipated or immoral. They were depicted as symbols of social decline, yet also as the faces of progress. Irene, without knowing it, lived at the center of that contradiction. By June, her friendship with Maxwell cooled. She remained polite at work but turned her attention to other pursuits. She went to the cinema with Ada, bought small gifts for friends, and began planning a holiday. The newspapers advertised seaside resorts, special excursion fairs, and the promise of rest. Flora, still cautious, invited her to Scotland. Irene chose otherwise. She wanted the South Coast, familiar but far enough from London to feel free. She chose Eastbourne after reading a travel guide. The language appealed to her sense of order, a place of refinement and good air, suitable for ladies traveling alone. The mention of refinement was important. Eastbourne was considered safer, more respectable than Brighton. It was not a place of scandals or cheap amusements. That reputation, ironically, would make it seem harmless to a girl who valued propriety as much as she valued independence. In the days before her departure, she bought postcards, a new notebook, and a small gift. A gold pencil case engraved with the initials J.M. It was for John Maxwell, though she told the shopkeeper it was for her uncle. The item cost 23 shillings and sixpence, a considerable sum for someone of her income. To others, this purchase might have seemed extravagant. To her, it was perhaps an act of gratitude or closure. She also began writing letters to friends, cheerful in tone, describing her excitement. One included a line that would later be quoted by reporters. "It will help me save my money. Besides, it is very much nicer if you can find someone to go about with." The words, innocent enough, were seized upon after her death as evidence of recklessness, proof that she had courted danger. But within context, they were the musings of a girl seeking companionship, not risk. That August, as she packed her clothes and counted her savings, a total of 7 pounds, the city around her hummed with heat and restlessness. The war's victory celebrations were fading into memory, and a new kind of fatigue had settled over Britain. The papers spoke of unemployment and disillusionment. The glamour of peacetime had begun to tarnish. For young women like Irene, the promise of progress seemed less like freedom and more like exposure. On the morning of Tuesday, 17th August, she kissed her mother goodbye. Flora, though anxious, said nothing. The journey to Eastbourne would take little more than 90 minutes by train, but emotionally it was a greater distance, the space between protection and independence, between caution and experience. The ticket collector marked her passage at Victoria. Outside, gulls circled over the gasworks, and the sky cleared as the train moved south. Irene watched the city recede into haze, the rooftops, the river, the endless gray. And then the open fields appeared, bright with late summer light. She would reach the coast by morning. Her suitcase was light, her mood expectant. It was not courage that carried her forward, but something quieter, the belief that ordinary life could still be kind. Flora Munro stood in the doorway of her South Kensington lodging as the train smoke drifted upward into the pale August light. She waved until she could no longer see her daughter's face, and even then she stayed a moment longer, as if habit might hold Irene in sight. To any passer-by, it was an ordinary farewell between mother and child, yet Flora felt unease, a sensation she had learned not to name. The instincts of women who have lived alone are often dismissed as worry. She folded her hands tightly, telling herself that Eastbourne was a respectable town, a safe place for a week's rest. Flora's life had been ruled by a single principle: caution. Born in the last decades of the Victorian era, she had been taught that safety and virtue were the same thing. Her work as a domestic servant had reinforced the lesson. A servant's reputation was her only protection. Employers could forgive clumsiness, but not impropriety. When she spoke to Irene about men, her warnings came not from moral superiority, but from the hard knowledge of vulnerability. She had seen how quickly gossip could destroy a woman's standing, how swiftly a misunderstanding could become dismissal. But Irene belonged to another time. Her generation had come of age during the war, when death had rendered prudence absurd. To them, caution looked like fear. They sought experience not as rebellion, but as proof of being alive. For Flora, independence was a risk. For Irene, dependence was a burden. Their affection was real, but their understanding of the world no longer matched. In the days after Irene's departure, Flora busied herself with her work. The household she managed belonged to a retired barrister and his wife, polite people who treated her with the condescending kindness reserved for reliable servants. She planned their dinners, kept the accounts, and arranged flowers for the drawing room. But each evening, when the house grew still, she caught herself glancing at the clock, wondering whether her daughter had found comfortable lodgings, whether she had eaten well, whether she might write. Irene, meanwhile, arrived at Eastbourne just after 8 o'clock on a bright Tuesday morning. The station was lively with holiday-makers, families from London with straw cases, elderly couples in search of sea air, and groups of young women like herself carrying parasols and anticipation. The town stretched ahead, clean, orderly, and faintly genteel. Rows of white villas faced the sea, and band music drifted faintly from the pier. She walked along Terminus Road, her small suitcase balanced carefully, taking in the novelty of being entirely alone. There was exhilaration in the freedom, and a flicker of loneliness, too. After an hour of searching, she found a room at 393 Seaside, a modest end-of-terrace house kept by Mrs. Winniett, a widow in her 50s who rented to single ladies during the summer season. The price, 30 shillings a week, was steep but manageable. Irene accepted without hesitation. Mrs. Winniett later recalled her as pleasant, respectable, and well-spoken. She noticed that the girl's manners were quiet, almost too careful. the bearing of someone accustomed to watching herself. Irene unpacked methodically, placing her few belongings in a small wardrobe and smoothing the coverlet before she left the room. When asked about her plans, she smiled and said, "I should have gone to Scotland with my mother, but I fancied the sea." That evening, she walked the promenade, watching the sun dissolve into the channel. Couples strolled arm in arm, and the air smelled of salt and fried potatoes from the stalls. The scene felt harmless, almost staged. Yet even here, in this polished resort, the social divisions of England persisted. The visitors who stayed in the grand hotels rarely mixed with those in lodging houses. Respectability was measured in distance, how near one sat to the bandstand, how far one's accent carried. Irene spent her first days quietly. She bought a dozen postcards, wrote to her mother and to Ada Beasley, describing the sea and the sound of the gulls. She walked through Hampton Park, sat reading on the beach, and watched children build castles that the tide quickly erased. Her clothes remained neat. She kept her gloves on as fashion still required. She did not bathe. Few women did. Modesty lingered even where propriety seemed relaxed. In one of her letters, she mentioned that money was running low and asked Flora to send a little more. It was a small request, phrased without complaint. Flora, receiving it 2 days later, was relieved to know her daughter was safe, but uneasy about the hint of extravagance. 30 shillings for lodgings, shillings for postcards and meals. The arithmetic troubled her. She sent the money nonetheless, tucking the notes into an envelope with careful handwriting. "To my dear daughter, from Mother." There is a poignancy in these exchanges that only hindsight reveals. Each woman, in her own way, was trying to preserve the bond that circumstance had thinned. Flora's letters were acts of protection, written in ink. Irene's, acts of independence, written in hope. Neither could foresee how quickly that correspondence would end. While Irene explored Eastbourne, she could not have known that her presence was already noticed. In small seaside towns, strangers were easy to recognize. A young woman traveling alone drew polite curiosity from some and speculation from others. Landladies compared notes. Shopkeepers watched. When she purchased a gold pencil case from a jeweler on Terminus Road, saying it was for her uncle, the details stuck in memory. Later, when police traced her steps, such fragments would become clues. Each evening, she returned to Mrs. Winniette's parlor to take tea. They spoke of the weather, of how crowded the town had become, of the price of coal. Nothing in Irene's manner suggested anxiety. She seemed content, even cheerful. But on the third night, she remarked that perhaps she ought to have gone north with her mother after all. "It feels a little dull here," she said lightly, "and the rooms are dear." Mrs. Winniette only smiled and told her the season would soon end, that the September winds would clear the crowds. That passing remark, half complaint, half confession, was the last ordinary conversation she would ever have. Flora's own days continued in London, structured by the rhythm of domestic service. Yet beneath the routine, she nursed an unspoken guilt. The argument over Ludwig's letter had left a trace of distance between them. She had meant to teach her daughter caution, not fear, and now she worried that her disapproval had driven Irene to prove herself independent. She reread Irene's earlier diary entries, which she had once scolded her for writing. "Just an ordinary girl," Irene had said. Flora wondered whether she had ever allowed her daughter to be ordinary, or whether she had demanded too much dignity for a life that offered so little joy. In another part of London, the newspapers were beginning to discuss a new phenomenon, the modern girl. She smoked cigarettes, danced, traveled alone, and disregarded conventions. Editorials alternately praised and condemned her. For many readers, she represented both the freedom and the decay of post-war society. When the Crumbles murder later broke, Irene would be cast in that role by journalists who never knew her, the young woman who wanted too much, who stepped beyond safety. But in these final quiet days of her holiday, she was simply a girl seeking air, sunlight, and perhaps a kind companion. On the morning of Thursday, 19th August, she rose early, dressed neatly, and mentioned she might walk to the park. The weather had turned cool. She put on her green coat with the imitation fur collar, the one her mother had admired and said looked a little too grand. She closed the door softly behind her and stepped into the brisk, salt air. Flora, in London, was polishing silver when the same breeze reached the open kitchen window. It carried the city's smoke, not the sea's freshness. She paused without knowing why, set the cloth aside, and looked out at the sky turning pale over the rooftops. For a moment, she thought of Irene, then turned back to her work. In Eastbourne, the band at the pier began its afternoon rehearsal, a faint melody that would drift, carried by the wind, across the flat expanse of beach known as the Crumbles. And somewhere, beyond the promenade and the last line of houses, Irene walked toward that sound. On the morning of Thursday, 19th August 1920, Eastbourne woke under a sky of muted gray. The wind that had been gentle all week had shifted slightly, cool against the late summer air. At the promenade, the tide rolled slow and heavy, and the gulls circled above the railings where visitors fed them crumbs from brown paper bags. By 9 o'clock, the brass band at the pier had begun another light overture, the same cheerful rhythm that filled every morning of the holiday season. In her small room at 393 Seaside, Irene Munro stood before the mirror, fastening the buttons of her green coat. She adjusted the imitation fur at the collar, brushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and slipped on her hat. The air in the lodging house smelled faintly of coal and salt. She paused a moment to glance at the small postcard she had written the night before, addressed to her mother, and smiled as she sealed it. She told Mrs. Winiett that she would be walking to Hampton Park, perhaps to sit by the lake with a book. There was a courtesy in her tone that landladies always remembered later, the mark of a girl who had learned to make people comfortable with her politeness. She carried her small blue handbag, the same one she'd used in London, and left the house just after 10. At the post office, she bought a stamp and sent her letter. Inside, she had written only a few sentences: that she was well, that the air was good, that she hoped her mother's trip north had been pleasant. But enclosed in the message was another request for money, phrased as gently as possible. 30 shillings a week was proving costly, and she had spent more than expected on meals and the pencil case gift. From the post office, she wandered toward the park, the path shaded by trees beginning to lose their summer edge. Witnesses later recalled seeing her seated on a bench near the lake, reading a small book. No one remembered the title. For an hour, she stayed there, feeding crumbs to the ducks, then walked back toward the sea. By early afternoon, she returned briefly to the house. Mrs. Winiett saw her through the window, her coat still buttoned. She asked if Irene had enjoyed the morning. "Very much," Irene replied. "I shall go out again before tea." It was about 2:30 when she stepped once more into the street. The clouds had thinned, and the air held that strange stillness that sometimes precedes an evening storm. Irene walked eastward in the direction of the long, open beach, known as the Crumbles. The Crumbles stretched for nearly 2 miles, a flat expanse of shingle, grass, and marsh between Eastbourne and Pevensey Bay. It was beautiful in its own barren way, but lonely. Local residents rarely walked there after dark. The land was undeveloped then, dotted with a few scattered sheds, a railway siding, and the occasional sandcart left by builders. To city visitors, it could seem remote, even wild. Sometime between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, 2 workmen painting the front of Mrs. Winiett's lodging house looked down from their ladders and saw Irene walking away from the town with 2 young men. She appeared cheerful, talking and laughing. One of the men carried a walking stick carved with the head of a dog, a detail that would later fix itself in the public imagination. The workmen thought nothing of it. Eastbourne was full of young people that summer, and it was not unusual for acquaintances to form quickly by the seaside, yet they noticed the direction, not toward the pier or the gardens, but toward the emptier end of the shore. Shortly afterward, near the Archery Tavern on Marine Parade, a sailor named William Putland and an ex-soldier, Fred Wells, saw the same trio walking together. Irene offered them sweets from a paper bag and paused to stroke a stray kitten that had followed them along the path. They passed through a gap in the fence near the railway, laughing. None of the witnesses could recall hearing distress or alarm. The scene was almost ordinary. To reconstruct her thoughts that afternoon is impossible, yet certain inferences seem clear. Irene had been alone for days, a young woman in a town where everyone else seemed paired. The conversation of strangers, especially those who seemed friendly, might have offered welcome diversion. There was, too, the optimism of youth, the belief that politeness would protect her, that danger belonged to other stories, not her own. Later witnesses described the two men in detail. One, younger and shorter, wore a blue suit. The other, older and taller, wore gray. They were identified as Jack Alfred Field, 19, and William Thomas Gray, 28. Both were unemployed, both known around town for their idle habits. They had been seen together often, approaching women along the promenade. Gray, a former soldier with scars from the war, was known for his charm and his temper. Field, the sailor, was quick to laugh and quicker to spend money he did not have. The railway workers who saw them later that afternoon recalled that the man in blue walked arm in arm with Irene. They seemed in good spirits, and the group passed out of sight beyond a small rise in the shingle. The men finished their lunch in a disused carriage nearby and heard nothing further. No shout, no struggle, only the wind and the distant hiss of the sea. By evening, the weather turned colder. When Irene did not return for supper, Mrs. Winiat assumed she had met a friend or perhaps stayed out to watch the sunset. It was not unusual for lodgers to miss a meal. The next morning, however, the bed remained untouched. Her hat still hung on the peg. Her book lay open on the table. By the second evening, when she had still not come back, Mrs. Winiat began to worry. She went to the police station, but before she could file a report, she read the news. Body of young woman found on the Crumbles. The description, dark hair, green coat with imitation fur, height about 5'7", left no doubt. While Flora received her daughter's final letter in London, the Eastbourne police were already combing the shore. The paper bag of sweets found in the pocket was still half full. The blue handbag was missing. Reporters, quick to assign motive, began speculating that a lover had killed her, perhaps to hide incriminating letters. Others hinted that she had been reckless, too familiar with strangers. The victim of violence was, as so often in such stories, transformed into a moral lesson. For Flora, the journey south was a blur of disbelief. She brought with her a handkerchief and the last photograph taken of Irene the previous Christmas. At the mortuary, when they lifted the sheet, she recognized the coat immediately. Her daughter's face was disfigured, but she saw the small scar near the ear and knew. She fainted before she could say the words. The investigators found little to go on. No footprints, no weapon besides the blood-stained stone, no sign of robbery except the missing purse. The Crumbles, with its shifting sand and wind, had already erased much of what had happened. It was a crime without witnesses, committed in daylight, in a place that seemed too open to hide anything. Yet even in that emptiness, the story took root. The image of the young woman in the green coat, the lonely beach, the men with the dog-headed stick, these details passed quickly from police notes to headlines. They fed the public imagination, which demanded not merely justice but narrative, a reason, a lesson, a villain. As night fell over the coast, the waves moved slowly up the shingle and back again, smoothing the marks left by the day. The wind carried a faint metallic scent from the stones. By morning, there would be only a patch of disturbed earth and a line of constables marking the edge of the scene. The town's band played again at noon, its melodies unchanged. Holidaymakers walked past, pausing only briefly to ask what had happened. The sea, vast and indifferent, offered no reply. By the time the morning edition reached the streets of Eastbourne, the crowd had already begun to gather near the police station. The photograph in the window of the Eastbourne Chronicle was grainy, printed from an artist's sketch. The outline of a woman's coat, the wide brim of a hat. The caption was brief and speculative, unidentified body found on the Crumbles. Beneath it, the words, "Police appeal for information." Inside, constables moved quietly between desks, comparing notes from witnesses. They had little to work with. The stone, the sweets, the footprints already softened by wind. Yet one officer, examining the clothing brought in from the beach, noticed a small label stitched inside the coat. Miss I. Munro, London. It was faint, almost worn away, but it was enough. A messenger was sent to 393 Seaside Road, where Mrs. Winiett kept her modest lodging house. When she opened the door and saw the uniform, she already suspected what they had come for. The news had spread quickly. The town was too small to keep secrets. She confirmed the handwriting on the label, her eyes filling as she spoke. "She was a good girl," she said quietly. "So polite, and never any trouble." At the mortuary that afternoon, she identified the body. She recognized the coat, the neat stitching at the hem she had complimented only days earlier, the small purse clasp that had been found nearby. Her voice trembled when she recalled their last conversation. She said she should have gone to Scotland with her mother. I wish she had. The official identification reached London within hours. Chief Inspector George Mercer, sent from Scotland Yard, arrived by the evening train. He was an experienced man, patient and methodical, known for his calm manner rather than his theatrics. Eastbourne police welcomed the assistance. It had been years since their town had seen a case of such magnitude. Mercer began by retracing the girl's last known movements. The first objective was simple: confirm her presence. Hour by hour, two painters working on the facade of 393 Seaside had seen her leave around 2:30, walking with two men. Both described her laughing, apparently at ease. Their memory of the dog-headed stick was striking, repeated independently. Mercer wrote it down. The next statement came from William Putland, the sailor, and Fred Wells, an ex-soldier. They had seen the same group on Marine Parade, Irene offering them sweets from a bag. Again, the descriptions matched. A tall man in gray, a younger one in blue. The shorter man carried the stick. They had passed through the fence toward the Crumbles, then disappeared from sight. The time, between 3 and 4 o'clock, fit the doctor's estimate of death. By evening, the pattern was clear. The two men had been seen together repeatedly around town, approaching women idling near the seafront taverns. Their names surfaced quickly: Jack Alfred Field and William Thomas Gray, both already familiar to the local constabulary for thefts and disturbances. Mercer ordered their arrest. Field was found first drinking at the Alhambra Public House, a narrow establishment off Terminus Road. He was 19, short, wiry, with sharp features and a quick, nervous smile. When the officers entered, he laughed and said, "What's all this, then?" The laughter faded when they mentioned the Crumbles. Gray was picked up 2 streets away outside the Archery Tavern, where he was known to linger. At 28, he looked older, the lines of hardship cut deep into his face. His limp, the result of a war wound, gave him a deliberate gait that witnesses had also noted. He did not resist arrest. At the station, both men denied everything. They claimed not to know any girl named Munro, not to have been near the Crumbles that day. Field said he had been playing cards with a lady friend. "Oh," Gray nodded in agreement. The supposed lady friend, when located, denied having seen them. Mercer observed them quietly as they spoke. He noticed that their clothes matched the witnesses' descriptions, one in blue, one in gray. More tellingly, the younger man's walking stick matched the account exactly, carved with the head of a dog, worn smooth at the handle. The stick was confiscated. The following day, Dr. James Adams, the police surgeon, examined Gray's trousers. There were several small stains, brownish red, inconsistent with the mud of the beach. Later, tests confirmed the stains were blood. While the investigation advanced, the press began to reshape the story. The Daily Mirror published Irene's photograph, cropped from a studio portrait, her face calm and composed, beneath a headline that read, "Holiday Murder Mystery, Pretty London Typist Slain on Sussex Shore." The choice of adjectives said more about the era than about the victim. Beauty was currency, and even in death, it was the lens through which the public understood women. Flora arrived in Eastbourne on Sunday, accompanied by a family friend. The police tried to prepare her, but nothing could blunt the shock. At the mortuary, she identified the body with a quiet composure that impressed even Mercer. "That's my daughter," she said, her voice steady until the moment she saw the coat again. "She made that button herself." Afterward, she sat in silence while Mercer explained what they knew. She listened, nodding occasionally, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Perhaps returning to the morning when she watched the train pull away. Guilt often finds the nearest heart to occupy, and Flora's was the nearest available. Public interest in the case grew by the hour. Reporters arrived from London, sketch artists from the illustrated weeklies, and even photographers from the new tabloid agencies. They took pictures of the Crumbles, the police station, and the lodging house. The local residents, both fascinated and alarmed, opened their doors to strangers who asked questions. The story, barely 2 days old, was already transforming from tragedy into spectacle. Meanwhile, Mercer's investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern. Field and Gray were known to approach women together, often pretending to be soldiers home on leave. They were not violent, at least not openly, but several witnesses described being followed or propositioned. One woman reported that Gray had once threatened her when she refused to walk with him. Another spoke of being cornered near the cliffs. The police questioned both men again. Field maintained that he had spent the afternoon around town, adding with forced casualness, "Ask anyone, we was just having a bit of fun." Gray's reply was sharper. "You can't prove anything." Mercer said nothing. He had heard those words too often. By Tuesday, the evidence had grown difficult to ignore. The walking stick could have delivered a blow. The stains on Gray's trousers matched blood. The witnesses were willing to testify. The Crown decided to proceed with formal charges. When the men were escorted from the station to the magistrate's court, a small crowd had gathered outside. Some watched in silence, others murmured disapproval. In a town built on propriety, murder carried the sense of contamination. People spoke of safety, of how such things might drive visitors away. Few spoke of the victim except in the language of pity or reproach. Mercer, standing at the back of the courtroom, knew how the story would unfold. The facts were clear enough, but the motive, the impulse that turned flirtation into killing, would remain elusive. Whether it was robbery, rage, or the humiliation of rejection, the line between them was thin. That night, as the train carried him back toward London to file his report, he looked out through the darkened carriage window. Beyond the glass lay the same flat stretch of coast where the wind never stopped. He thought of the mother returning home with her daughter's suitcase and of how quickly a journey meant for rest had turned to ruin. At 393 Seaside Road, the small room remained untouched. On the bedside table, Mrs. Winiat had placed a single flower in a cup, a gesture without audience. Outside, the band on the pier played to the evening crowd, the music carrying faintly across the water. The sea continued its rhythm, patient and unaltered, erasing every footprint by dawn. The Crumbles, once a barren margin between land and sea, had become the focus of an entire nation's attention. Reporters descended on it as though the stones themselves might yield confession. They walked in slow lines, notebooks in hand, studying the horizon for meaning. The waves, indifferent, erased each footprint as they went. The landscape seemed made to frustrate certainty. No fixed path, no clear boundary between sand and shingle. For the investigators, reconstructing Irene Munro's final walk was like tracing vapor. The witnesses had seen her cheerful, talking to two men. After that, nothing. No scream was heard, no struggle witnessed. And yet, by late afternoon, she was dead. Chief Inspector George Mercer, careful and methodical, began where evidence still held shape. The accounts of those who had watched her leave the lodging house and those who had seen her later on the beach. Each statement was a fragment, but together they began to suggest a rhythm, a series of small, fatal choices made in ordinary confidence. The two painters stationed outside 393 Seaside Road had watched Irene depart with the men. One, perched high on a ladder, recalled her laughter as she turned back to say something. Her tone was light, teasing, the way one might speak to new acquaintances. The younger man in blue had been walking close beside her, his stick swinging idly. The older one, taller and slower, walked just behind. The painter remembered thinking they looked like friends, not strangers. From there, Mercer followed the line of sight eastward. The promenade narrowed, and the shops gave way to open fields. Beyond them, a path cut toward the railway embankment, where a gap in the fence led to the Crumbles. It was here that the sailor William Putland and the ex-soldier Fred Wells had seen the trio. Their testimony was precise. They described Irene pausing to pet a stray kitten, laughing as the men watched. She carried a paper bag of sweets, offering them casually. The men took some, and all three passed through the fence. The image haunted Mercer. There was no fear in it, no visible warning, only a brief moment of human warmth before the cruelty that followed. Violence often began that way, disguised as familiarity. Past the fence, the ground sloped gently toward the sea. The terrain was uneven. Patches of coarse grass, shingle, and scattered stones. The place was both open and isolating. A person could be within shouting distance of a road and yet unseen. It was there, perhaps halfway between the railway and the tide line, that the murder must have occurred. Dr. Ernest Cadman, who first examined the scene, had recorded the time of death between noon and midnight on the 19th. But given the witnesses' accounts, Mercer narrowed it further, sometime between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. The body had been hidden beneath only a thin layer of shingle, suggesting haste rather than calculation. The absence of footprints around it pointed to wind and tide doing their slow work overnight. The question of motive remained. The missing blue handbag suggested robbery, but the evidence contradicted it. Irene's other possessions were intact. The killer had left even small coins untouched. Some speculated that the men had panicked, that an argument had turned violent. Others whispered of something darker, an unwanted advance, resistance, and retaliation. When questioned again, both Field and Gray clung to their denials. Field, the younger, insisted he had never seen the girl. His voice was quick, rehearsed. Gray, in contrast, grew irritable, his composure thinning with each question. "We were nowhere near the Crumbles," he repeated. "You'll not prove otherwise." Mercer listened, saying little. Experience had taught him that guilt often revealed itself not in words but in rhythm. The pauses, the unnecessary defensiveness. Gray's tone was not fear, but defiance, as if moral law no longer applied to him. He requested background checks on both men. What emerged was a portrait of drift and disappointment, common to post-war Britain, but intensified by personal failures. Jack Alfred Field, 19, had enlisted in the Royal Navy as a boy, hoping for adventure. He was discharged 6 months earlier for going absent without leave. Since then, he had lived on the margins. Petty thefts, casual work, brief stays with relatives. He was known locally for his quick charm and short temper. Friends described him as the laughing sort, a young man who smiled even when lying. William Thomas Gray, 28, had come from further away. Born in South Africa to Scottish parents, he had fought in the war, sustaining gunshot wounds to his face and leg. His discharge left him with a small pension and no purpose. He married a 16-year-old Eastbourne girl soon after returning, but the marriage soured. His wife, working as a servant, supported him while he drifted between jobs. Several women came forward during the investigation, describing encounters with Gray. One said he had followed her along the promenade, insisting she walk with him. Another, braver, admitted he had threatened her when she refused his advances. In one case, a young woman reported that he tried to drag her toward the cliffs, saying he would throw her over if she didn't behave. The complaint had gone nowhere at the time. The constable had dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Now, those testimonies painted a chilling pattern. The persistence of a man accustomed to being ignored, the escalating anger of someone who could not bear rejection. Gray's friendship with Field seemed unlikely at first glance. One a war-scarred drifter, the other a boyish delinquent. But together they formed a dynamic familiar to criminologists even then. Dominance and imitation. Gray, older and more confident, provided the bravado. Field, eager to impress, supplied the recklessness. In their small, impoverished world, the humiliation of failure was masked by performance. They prowled the beaches together, seeking laughter, attention, and the illusion of power. When Mercer reviewed the evidence again, one phrase from the cell log caught his attention. The constable on duty had overheard Field mutter, "We're in a nice pickle now. How are we going to prove where we were on Thursday afternoon?" It was the kind of slip that confirmed what denial tried to hide. Meanwhile, public opinion swelled. The case had all the elements that stirred fascination: youth, beauty, respectability, betrayal. Editorials debated whether modern girls were courting danger by traveling alone. Letters to newspapers alternated between sympathy for the victim and condemnation of her indiscretion. The social fabric of the time demanded that morality explain misfortune, even when the cause was plainly cruelty. In London, Flora read those headlines in silence. Her grief, already unbearable, was now shadowed by the insinuations of strangers. The photographs of her daughter were printed without consent, the captions intrusive. The pretty victim of the Crumbles. Flora wrote a short letter to the editor of one paper, asking that her daughter's name be treated with respect. It was never published. At the police station, Mercer prepared his final report before the transfer to the magistrate's court. The physical evidence, the stick, the blood, the witnesses, was sufficient. But he could not help lingering on the psychology. Crimes of impulse revealed the fault lines of society: poverty, disillusionment, and a culture that rewarded dominance in men while condemning independence in women. Irene's death, he thought, was not only the act of two men, but the outcome of a system that had failed to civilize them after the war. The inquest opened quietly with few spectators. The medical testimony was brief but brutal. Dr. Adams described the fractures to the skull, the scattered teeth, the bruising around the jaw. The blow from the stone had been fatal. The stick might have been used first. There were gasps from the public benches. The coroner concluded death by violence inflicted by persons unknown. Outside, the reporters were already writing their next lines. The case would not rest on nuance or social analysis. It would rest on narrative. The innocent girl, the predatory men, the justice soon to come. As evening fell over Eastbourne, Mercer walked once more along the edge of the Crumbles. The wind had calmed, and the sea shimmered faintly under the fading light. He paused where the body had been found, the stones now smoothed by tide. Somewhere nearby, the waves carried the faint sound of music drifting from the pier. It was the same melody that had played on the day of her death. Cheerful, unknowing. He stood a long while listening, before turning back toward the town. The case was nearly solved, yet the questions it raised would not leave him. What drives cruelty in the ordinary, and how easily might it rise again, given the same poverty, the same neglect, the same silence from those who should have acted sooner? The band stopped playing. The last note lingered briefly in the air, and then only the wind remained. In every murder case, there comes a moment when speculation gives way to the weight of evidence, something solid that resists denial. In the story of Irene Munro, that moment arrived with a single object, the stone. Heavy, ordinary, and silent, it lay beside her body when the police first lifted the shingle from the Crumbles. At first glance, it was nothing more than a piece of beach debris, streaked with rust-colored stains. But under the lamplight of the mortuary, it told a story more precise than any witness could recall. Dr. Ernest Cadman, who had first examined the scene, returned to study it again. The stone, roughly the size of a man's fist, bore patches of dried blood and small fibers of hair pressed into its surface. Its weight was deceptive. To lift it was to understand the violence it had delivered. Cadman measured the indentations on Irene's skull and found that one corresponded exactly to the stone's edge. The blow had been struck from the right, at close range. The realization unsettled even the seasoned investigators. It suggested not a scuffle or an accident, but intent, a choice carried out with deliberate force. Cadman's report, delivered in the crisp language of pathology, left no room for sentiment. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted with a heavy object consistent with a stone recovered at the scene. For Chief Inspector George Mercer, this object was more than evidence. It was the physical echo of the men's denial. The walking stick might have begun the attack, a gesture of control or anger. But the stone, the improvised weapon, was what turned cruelty into murder. In the simplicity of the act lay its horror. There was no sophistication, no cunning, only the primitive certainty of domination. The press seized upon the detail immediately. "The bloody stone of the Crumbles," one headline read, as if naming it could transform brutality into legend. The public's imagination was quick to fill the gaps. Artists' renderings showed a girl fleeing across the shingle, her pursuers faceless against the sea. None of it was true, but it made the tragedy readable, consumable, almost comforting in its fiction. Mercer avoided the papers. He preferred the quiet of the evidence room, where the exhibits lay sealed and labeled. Exhibit A, coat, green, fur-trimmed. Exhibit B, walking stick, dog's head handle. Exhibit C, stone, blood-stained. On another shelf rested smaller items, postcards, the broken comb from Irene's handbag, the few coins found in her pocket. Each fragment was a window into ordinariness. In their cells, Jack Field and William Gray were beginning to fracture under the monotony of questioning. Field, quick-talking and easily swayed, alternated between bravado and fear. "You've nothing on me," he told the guard one day, and the next, "If Gray hadn't made me go with him, none of this would have happened." Gray, older and harder, met every accusation with contempt. "You think a man like me would kill a girl?" he said. "You don't know what war does." War had indeed done much. To men of Gray's generation, violence had become an unremarkable language. The Great War had normalized cruelty, dressing it in medals and silence. When he returned home wounded, limping through a country that no longer needed him, the skills that had once made him useful, control, aggression, endurance, were meaningless. For years afterward, he drifted from job to job, sustaining himself on alcohol and the occasional charity of his wife's wages. The self he had been in uniform never entirely left him. It simply rotted in the open air of peacetime. Field, by contrast, belonged to the generation that had missed the war but inherited its debris. He was the child of poverty and boredom, raised on stories of glory that no longer matched reality. Discharged from the Navy for indiscipline, he spent his days loafing along the seafront, charming girls and stealing small sums. Gray had found in him a willing apprentice, someone to laugh at his jokes, to echo his swagger, to help him forget his own decline. In that strange alchemy of power and imitation, the two men became dangerous. When Mercer imagined the scene, though he rarely allowed himself the indulgence, he pictured them walking with Irene toward the empty expanse of the Crumbles. Perhaps Gray spoke first, coaxing her further from the town. Field, eager to impress, followed along. The conversation might have turned flirtatious or uneasy. Maybe she refused an advance. Maybe she laughed. Maybe she said no too firmly. in that moment of resistance, Gray's temper would have shifted from charm to rage. The first blow, perhaps from the stick, would have startled her more than injured. The second, with the stone, silenced her completely. Afterward, they dragged the body a few yards and covered it with shingle. The rest, her missing handbag, the scattered teeth, the quieting of the wind, was detail. Such reconstructions were never proof, but they were the closest thing to understanding. Mercer included none of this speculation in his report. He confined himself to what could be shown: the matched injuries, the witnesses, the blood, the missing purse. Yet even he could not escape the thought that the true motive might never be known. Crimes like this did not begin with reason. They began with emptiness. As the evidence mounted, public fascination deepened. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each morning to catch a glimpse of the accused. Women whispered to one another about their own daughters traveling alone. Men shook their heads, calling it a shame. Moral outrage became a kind of entertainment, and Eastbourne, embarrassed by its sudden notoriety, tried to frame the murder as an aberration, a stain on an otherwise respectable town. Inside the small courtroom where the preliminary hearings were held, the atmosphere was dense with heat and curiosity. The magistrate sat impassive as witnesses described the events of that Thursday. Mrs. Winiat spoke quietly, her hands clasped. The painters told their story, followed by Putland and Wells. Each detail added another stone to the weight of certainty. When the blood-stained evidence was produced, even the spectators fell silent. The doctor's clinical voice describing the injuries in measured phrases reduced the violence to anatomy. Some women in the gallery looked away. Field sat pale and restless, twisting his fingers. Gray stared ahead, his face unreadable. For all their bravado, neither man could entirely mask the fatigue of guilt. Mercer, observing from the back, recognized the familiar pattern, the shrinking of possibility. Once accused, a man's imagination begins to collapse inward. He no longer sees the world, but only the narrowing path to his own end. By the time the magistrate committed them for trial at the next assizes, the outcome seemed inevitable. The public already believed in their guilt, and the law, while careful, rarely disappointed public expectation. That night, the wind rose again over the Crumbles. The tide, reaching further inland, touched the spot where the body had been found and drew back, leaving only darkened stones. A constable stationed nearby wrote later that he could hear the faint echo of the sea through the open window of his hut. It sounded, he said, as if someone were breathing. For the townspeople, the landscape itself had changed. The Crumbles was no longer merely a stretch of beach. It was a symbol of vulnerability, of how quickly safety could dissolve into tragedy. Mothers began warning their daughters not to walk there alone. Local newspapers printed sentimental poems titled "The Girl of the Green Coat." Memory, as always, softened the edges of horror, turning it into moral caution. But Mercer, reading his reports by lamplight in his office, felt only the weight of routine. There would be other murders, other victims, other stones. The system would move forward as it always did, grinding grief into procedure. He placed the photographs back into their folder, closed the file marked Munro Irene V, and paused for a moment before extinguishing the lamp. In the half-darkness, the image lingered, a stretch of beach, a still body, and a stone that once fit the shape of a human hand. It was the simplest weapon imaginable, one that could have been found anywhere, by anyone. And perhaps that was what disturbed him most. Evil, when stripped of its embellishments, was not mysterious at all. It was ordinary. Outside, the sea moved again, untroubled and exact in its rhythm, washing away the shore one grain at a time. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way the world learns a victim's name. For days, she is an abstraction, a young woman, unidentified. Then, with one announcement, she becomes specific, a life with handwriting, habits, belongings, a mother waiting for a letter that will never come. In Eastbourne, that transition happened quietly. The notice pinned to the door of the police station no longer read, "Unknown female." It now bore the name Miss Irene Violet Munro, age 17, of London. The confirmation brought both relief and unease. The police had a name, but the town lost its anonymity. A story with a name becomes harder to ignore. Shopkeepers who had once speculated idly now lowered their voices. Mothers glanced at their daughters differently. The Crumbles, only a few days earlier a desolate stretch of stones, was now a place where a known person had died. It felt nearer. Chief Inspector George Mercer stood at the mortuary as reporters gathered outside. He disliked the crowd, the smell of ink, the constant scratching of pens. They were waiting for the formal identification. Inside, Flora Munro sat alone, her gloved hands folded on her lap, her face a pale stillness that spoke more than tears could have. Beside her stood Mrs. Wynniett, the landlady who had taken Irene in and who now felt as if she had failed her. When the attendant pulled back the sheet, the room seemed to contract. The light from the high window fell across the familiar green coat, its collar slightly torn where the fabric had caught against the shingle. Flora leaned forward, searching the face she had known since infancy, and whispered the words that closed all possibility. "Yes, my daughter." She fainted soon after. The doctor led her away while the clerk recorded the identification. In the report, the sentence appeared plain, almost indifferent. Identification established by mother of deceased. Positive. Yet the effect of those words radiated outward. To the police, to the journalists, to the public imagination, which now had its heroine and its tragedy. That evening, photographs appeared in London papers. The editors requested them from the family. When Flora declined, they obtained one through a former colleague of Irene's at the office. The image was small, taken in better times. Irene seated, slightly turned, her hair pinned neatly, her expression calm. Underneath the headline, "Typist's holiday ends in murder, the victim of the Crumbles tragedy." The choice of phrasing, almost theatrical, transformed her from a person into a symbol. In the following days, the press developed an appetite not for truth, but for tone. They described her as pretty, refined, ambitious, as if beauty and decency could substitute for justice. Others hinted that she had been too modern, too friendly with men, too trusting. The pendulum of public opinion swung between pity and moral instruction, neither capable of acknowledging her as simply human. For Mercer, the spectacle was predictable. He had seen it before, the blending of grief and entertainment that followed every sensational case. But what struck him most was the speed with which Irene's image was reconstructed by strangers. Each article offered a version of her: the innocent victim, the naive girl, the modern flirt. None were true in full, but all contained fragments of reality. Society needed her to play a role because her ordinariness was unbearable. The police, under pressure from Scotland Yard and the Home Office, accelerated their work. Witness statements were rechecked, timetables compared. The walking stick found in Field's possession was shown to several witnesses, all of whom identified it immediately. Its carved dog's head was unmistakable. "Doctor," Adams's laboratory confirmed the traces of human blood on Gray's trousers, and although the test could not yet match the blood type to the victim, forensic science was still too crude for such precision, the conclusion was implicit. Both men were formally charged with murder. They were transferred to Maidstone Prison to await trial, their portraits published in every major newspaper. In Field's photograph, he looks almost childlike, his collar slightly too large for his neck, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. Gray's face, by contrast, is composed, almost proud, his jaw set, his gaze defiant. Their photographs became opposites in a moral diagram, youth corrupted and experience embittered. Meanwhile, Flora remained in Eastbourne for the inquest. The coroner's court was a small, wood-paneled room, already filled when she arrived. She sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped around a folded handkerchief. The proceedings were brisk. "Doctor." Cadman summarized his findings. The injuries, the time of death, the weapon. The jurors, all men, listened in grave silence. There was no cross-examination, no discussion of character. At that stage, the purpose was merely procedural, to confirm that a crime had been committed by person or persons unknown. The jury returned its verdict in 10 minutes. As she left the court, a journalist approached Flora and asked whether she wished to make a statement about her daughter. She said only, "She was a good girl, that is all." It was the most truthful sentence spoken about Irene that week, and it was printed in a single line buried beneath the headlines. That night, in her rented room, Flora unpacked Irene's suitcase. The contents were heartbreakingly ordinary. 2 dresses neatly folded, a hat with a bent feather, the empty box from the gold pencil case she had bought before leaving London. Among the papers was a small diary with several blank pages and one final entry dated August 17th. "Arrived safely. The sea is very calm. I think I shall like it here." Outside, Eastbourne tried to resume its rhythm. The band played again at the pier, the hotels filled with guests, and the souvenir shops reopened. Yet the town had changed in ways it could not admit. The residents avoided the Crumbles now, and even children playing on the beach were called back sooner than usual. The landscape, once neutral, carried an undertone of guilt. In London, the newspapers serialized the investigation, alternating between updates on the suspects and sentimental sketches of Irene's life. One Sunday paper published a drawing of her walking along the promenade, accompanied by the caption, "The Last Walk of a London Girl." The illustration was pure invention, but the public accepted it readily. It gave the tragedy a shape that reality lacked. Mercer, reading these reports, understood the paradox. The more vividly the press painted Irene's story, the further she receded from the truth. The woman who had lived, worked, and worried about rent became an emblem of fragility, an object of collective mourning that concealed rather than revealed the forces that had killed her. Poverty, indifference, and the quiet cruelty of men like Gray, who moved unchallenged through polite society. In late September, when the formal trial date was set for December, Mercer visited Flora one final time. She was packing to return to London, her manner calm but distant, as though grief had crystallized into something colder. He asked whether she had family to support her. She nodded faintly. "I have work," she said. "That will do." Before leaving, she handed him a photograph, the same one the newspapers had printed, but in its original form, uncut. "Keep it," she said. "I want someone to remember her without the headlines." Mercer accepted it silently. When he boarded the evening train back to London, the photograph remained in his pocket. He did not look at it until the compartment was empty. The image was small and slightly faded, the edges worn from being handled. Her expression was not tragic, but thoughtful, as if caught between shyness and determination. He realized that this was the only real face in the entire case. Everything else was distortion, reproduction, invention. Outside the carriage window, the last traces of daylight flattened over the downs. The sea was invisible now, only its scent carried inland by the wind. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the Crumbles, the shingle already cooling under the night. The papers would soon move on, the trial would follow, and justice in its formal way would be delivered. But as Mercer stared at the photograph, he wondered what justice could mean when the dead could no longer speak for themselves, when all that remained of a life was a face printed on fading paper and a story retold until truth dissolved into repetition. He folded the photograph carefully and placed it inside his notebook. The train shuddered onward through the dark, the rhythm of the wheels echoing like a slow heartbeat, steady, unfeeling, and unending. In the weeks that followed the inquest, attention shifted from the victim to the men accused of killing her. Newspapers began their slow excavation of personal histories, searching for meaning in the lives of the accused. It was not enough that they had been caught. Readers wanted to understand, or at least to imagine, why they had done it. But the stories of William Thomas Gray and Jack Alfred Field offered no grand motives, no clever deceptions. They were not the polished villains of fiction, nor the master criminals of penny dreadfuls. They were fragments of a generation dislocated by war, by poverty, and by the quiet erosion of moral purpose. William Gray had been born in South Africa to Scottish parents in the late 1890s, during the uneasy years of the empire's expansion. His father, a railway foreman, died when Gray was still a child. By suicide, some said, though the official record named it an accident. His mother returned to Britain with 2 small children and little money. By 16, William was working as a dock laborer in Durban. By 19, he had enlisted in the army, driven by restlessness and a sense of misplaced patriotism. He arrived in England in 1916 with the South African Expeditionary Forces, tall, confident, and ready for adventure. Within months, he was fighting on the Western Front. The experience left him marked, both physically and inwardly. A bullet wound to his leg gave him a limp that never fully healed. Shrapnel scars marred the side of his face. The war had awarded him nothing but disillusionment. When peace came, Gray found himself unfit for steady labor and untrained for anything else. The demobilization pay disappeared quickly. By 1919, he was living in Eastbourne, drawn by the mild climate and the chance of seasonal work. He married a local girl named Margaret, barely 16 at the time, who worked as a domestic servant. They lodged with her mother, sharing a single room. Within a year, the marriage soured. He drank heavily, quarreled often, and lived largely on his wife's small earnings. The town knew him as Billy, a familiar figure on the promenade, often seen leaning against the railings or loitering outside the pubs along Marine Parade. He spoke with an accent that hinted at foreign origins, which lent him a kind of dangerous charm. Women noticed him. Men avoided confrontation. He cultivated the impression of mystery, though in truth, he had nowhere to go and nothing to do. Police records later revealed a long trail of complaints about his conduct. Following women, making crude remarks, refusing to take no for an answer. In an era that still treated harassment as trivial, he escaped with warnings. One constable wrote in his report, "Persistent but harmless fellow." The irony of that phrase would linger bitterly after Irene Munro's death. Jack Field, by contrast, was almost half a generation younger. Born in London in 1901, the son of a dock worker and a laundress. His childhood was defined by overcrowded rooms, the smell of damp clothes drying above the stove, and the uncertainty of casual labor. At 15, he ran away from home and joined the Royal Navy, lying about his age. The sea, he thought, would offer escape. It offered instead routine, hierarchy, and eventual disgrace. He went absent without leave in 1919, was caught and discharged in early 1920. The record read indiscipline and theft of rations. With no trade and no references, he drifted south along the coast, living on small thefts and charm. He had a gift for talk, the kind of lightness that made him likable even when he was lying. Locals remembered him as the sailor boy, always smiling, always broke. When he met Gray sometime in the spring of 1920, the connection was immediate. Each recognized in the other what they lacked alone. For Gray, someone to admire him. For Field, someone to lead him. Together, they became a familiar pair around Eastbourne, the tall veteran and the wiry youth, haunting the taverns near the seafront, borrowing cigarettes, making jokes at women passing by. They were not the only idle men of their kind. Post-war England was full of them, but their partnership carried a volatility born of boredom and thwarted pride. Mercer, reading through their histories, saw a pattern that went beyond individual pathology. It was a symptom of a wider malaise, the kind that gripped many towns in the early 1920s, when the glow of victory had faded and the promise of peace had curdled into economic stagnation. Britain was changing. The factories slowed, the cost of living rose, and the veterans returned to find no place waiting for them. Men who had once commanded respect as soldiers were now regarded as nuisances. The structure that had given their lives meaning had vanished. In that vacuum, smaller tyrannies emerged. For men like Gray, accustomed to control through force, the new freedoms of women were intolerable. For boys like Field, charm became currency. The two together formed an uneasy alliance, predator and accomplice, each needing the other to sustain the illusion of power. Their days followed a pattern. Morning saw them loitering by the pier, afternoons spent in the Alhambra or Archery Tavern, nursing cheap ale, evenings prowling the promenade for conversation. Witnesses recalled that Gray often introduced himself as a bachelor, despite his marriage, and boasted of his exploits in France. Field played the clown, laughing easily, stealing small items from shops or acquaintances. It was during one of these idle afternoons that they first noticed Irene Munro. She was walking alone near the Albany Hotel, pausing occasionally to look at the sea. To them, she must have seemed a perfect mark. Young, unaccompanied, polite. Gray approached her, likely with the practiced confidence of a man who had done so many times before. Field, observing, joined in the conversation. Witnesses later said the three walked together toward Beachy Head, talking easily. That first encounter ended without incident. They parted near the pier, agreeing perhaps to meet again. The next day, the meeting turned fatal. What began as the shallow pursuit of amusement became an irreversible act of violence. At Maidstone Prison, while awaiting trial, the difference between the two men grew sharper. Field's bravado collapsed into fear. He slept little, spoke constantly, and seemed desperate to shift blame. To the warders, he appeared like a boy caught in mischief too large for comprehension. Gray remained cold, self-contained, his anger directed inward. He told one cellmate that he was being framed, that they always pick on the soldier. Another inmate serving a short sentence for theft later reported overhearing Gray say, "If I hadn't had that young fool with me, none of this would have come out." The words were part resentment, part confession. They revealed a hierarchy even in guilt. Gray the leader, Field the instrument. Mercer visited the prison once before the trial. He found Field trembling, his eyes darting nervously. "I didn't mean to hurt her," the boy muttered. "We only wanted to talk." Gray refused to speak at all. He sat motionless, his hands clasped, staring at the wall. Mercer recognized the expression, the same frozen certainty he had seen in other killers who could not admit the finality of what they had done. Outside the prison walls, the machinery of justice turned with steady indifference. The Crown assembled its case. The newspapers rehearsed their headlines. The public wanted punishment, but they also wanted to understand, to see in the condemned men a reflection of their own fears about what Britain was becoming. In parlors and workplaces, people debated not just guilt, but cause. Some blamed drink, others the decay of discipline after the war. A few saw in it the collapse of moral authority, the inevitable outcome of a society where the old hierarchies were crumbling like the very beach that gave the crime its name. Yet few asked why the warning signs had been ignored, why complaints against Gray had gone unheeded, or why a culture that celebrated masculine aggression in war found it so difficult to restrain it in peace. When the date of the trial was announced, December 1920, at the Lewis Assizes, the townspeople marked their calendars as if for a civic event. Tickets for seats in the gallery were requested weeks in advance. The same public that had once enjoyed summer music on the promenade would now attend another performance, this time of justice. For Gray and Field, the waiting was the true punishment. Each day brought them closer to a courtroom where their lives would be dissected before strangers. They had lost control of their story. Now it belonged to the state, to the papers, to history. Mercer closed his file on them with a weariness that felt almost like pity. In their different ways, they were both casualties, of war, of poverty, of ignorance. But pity could not restore the dead, nor undo the cruelty that had shattered an ordinary life. The law would do what it always did: assign blame, pronounce sentence, and move on. Outside, December approached. The sea grew colder, the sky leaden. On stormy nights, the wind swept across the Crumbles with a sound like distant thunder. Those who lived nearby said it reminded them of footsteps, two pairs fading toward the tide. The first winter winds came early to Eastbourne that year. They stripped the promenade of its gaiety, carrying the scent of seaweed and coal dust. The shutters on the guest houses closed, the music from the pier faded, and the seafront returned to the quiet that locals called normality. Yet beneath that calm, another current stirred, one of unease, of belated recognition. The town could no longer pretend that the murder on the Crumbles was an anomaly. In the days leading up to the trial, Chief Inspector George Mercer continued his work, collecting additional testimony. It was during these final weeks of inquiry that a pattern, long invisible, emerged into view. One by one, women began to come forward, not out of confidence in the law, but out of fear that silence might invite further tragedy. Their stories, though fragmented, formed a chilling chorus. The first was a seamstress named Ellen Drury, who recalled an encounter with William Gray earlier that summer. She'd been walking home from work when he approached her near the Archery Tavern, complimenting her dress and asking if she would join him for a drink. When she refused, his manner changed. "You think you're too good for me?" he had said, his accent sharpening. He followed her for 2 streets before she reached her boarding house. She told the constable on duty that night, but he dismissed it with a laugh. "He's a bit of a nuisance, that one," the constable had said. "Best to ignore him." The next account came from a housemaid who wished to remain anonymous. She had met Gray near the cliffs of Beachy Head, where he told her he had once served with distinction in France. He spoke of the beauty of the sea, how it called to him. When she turned to leave, he blocked her path and told her that if she screamed, no one would ever hear. She managed to slip away when another walker appeared on the path. The encounter, never reported, had haunted her for months. Other women described similar experiences: a man who watched from doorways, who lingered too long near the pier, who addressed strangers with the easy assumption of familiarity. The details varied, but the tone was the same, a mixture of charm, entitlement, and threat. And always, the same name followed: Billy Gray. These testimonies, gathered quietly and too late, revealed what the town had chosen not to see. Gray had been a predator in plain sight. He was tolerated because he fit a pattern that society preferred to ignore. The troublesome veteran, the man with a past, who was pitied rather than feared. The assumption of harmlessness was itself an indulgence. It allowed danger to pass for eccentricity. Mercer, reading the statements in his office, understood how systemic the failure had been. The machinery of law was built to respond to crime, not to prevent it. Misconduct that fell short of physical harm was dismissed as nuisance. The women who had spoken now did so in whispers, as if ashamed to have survived. Their caution was justified. In 1920, for a woman to accuse a man publicly was to invite scrutiny of her own conduct. Respectability was fragile. Self-protection depended on silence. The newspapers, however, handled the revelations with predictable inconsistency. Some papers treated the new information as confirmation of Gray's guilt. Others used it as moral instruction, suggesting that young women of independent habits attracted trouble by venturing out alone. The implication was that Irene's fate, though tragic, had been partly self-inflicted. It was a logic that turned victimhood into lesson and crime into parable. For the town itself, the exposure was humiliating. Eastbourne prided itself on its orderliness, its reputation as a refined resort. The thought that one of its own residents had stalked and murdered a visitor was unbearable. Local councils hastened to declare that Gray and Field were not true Eastbourne men, as though geography could absolve morality. Yet they had lived there for years, invisible in their idleness. Field's role in these events was harder to define. Unlike Gray, he had no long record of harassment. His crimes were petty, opportunistic, thefts from shops, from his mother's purse, from acquaintances. But in Gray's company, his behavior changed. He mimicked the older man's swagger, laughed at his crude jokes, and joined his approach to women with the eager complicity of a boy seeking approval. The dynamic between them was not friendship, but apprenticeship. The psychology of such partnerships fascinated Mercer, though it offered no comfort. Gray possessed the dominant will. Field provided validation. Together they became a single organism. One brain, two bodies. It was a pattern familiar to criminologists even then, appearing in cases from Whitechapel to Glasgow, the pairing of a manipulative aggressor with a suggestible accomplice. Each drew from the other a sense of identity that neither could sustain alone. In the prison interviews that followed their arrest, the difference between them widened. Gray remained defiant, claiming that he had been framed by gossip and prejudice. He spoke bitterly of the army, of the government that had used him and cast him aside. Field, by contrast, oscillated between bravado and remorse. He admitted being with Irene on the day she died, but insisted he had left before anything happened. When told that Gray placed the blame on him, he broke down, weeping and shouting, "He told me she was just fainted." Such contradictions were common. Each sought to preserve a fragment of innocence by shifting the burden of guilt. But in their inconsistency lay confirmation of complicity. Mercer knew that truth often revealed itself in the gaps between lies. While the men awaited trial, Eastbourne sought purification through ritual. The local clergy preached sermons on morality. Newspapers published letters urging stricter standards for young women. Even the tourist board issued statements emphasizing that the Crumbles were entirely safe for respectable visitors. The effort to restore normality became an act of denial. No one spoke of the deeper causes: the poverty that left men idle, the trauma that left them ungoverned, the social codes that left women unprotected. The irony, as Mercer saw it, was that the same moral system which condemned Irene for her independence had excused men like Gray for their aggression. Society valued female virtue as a symbol, but neglected female safety as a duty. The imbalance was ancient, inherited, and persistent. It turned every act of violence into a reinforcement of the order that had permitted it. In London, Flora followed the news with a numb kind of endurance. She clipped the articles, though she rarely read them twice. Each paragraph felt like a distortion, yet she could not look away. The faces of the accused appeared on every front page, the older one sullen, the younger almost frightened. She had no wish for vengeance, only for understanding, though she knew the court would offer none. Justice, when delivered, would belong to the state, not to her. By November, the preparations for the trial were nearly complete. Witness lists were finalized. The Crown's Counsel assembled its arguments. The evidence would be presented at Lewis Assizes before Mr. Justice Avery, known for his stern demeanor and unflinching adherence to procedure. The defense, meanwhile, was funded by a tabloid newspaper, hoping to secure the men's confessions for exclusive publication. The arrangement blurred the line between journalism and justice, a sign of the age's fascination with crime as spectacle. In the evenings, Mercer often walked along the Crumbles after his work was done. The winter air was sharp, and the sound of the sea carried like breath through the darkness. He found the place unchanged, the same wind, the same stones, but his perception of it had altered. It was no longer merely a crime scene. It was a landscape of omissions, of warnings unheard, of complaints dismissed, of human negligence disguised as civility. He thought of the women who had spoken up too late, of the constable who had laughed off Ellen Drury's fear, of the way the town had prided itself on its refinement while allowing predation to flourish beneath its surface. The murder of Irene Munro had not been a single act of cruelty. It was the final expression of a system that had mistaken silence for peace. When he returned to his lodgings, the streets were deserted. A single lamp flickered at the corner of Seaside Road. The light caught on the rain-slick pavement, reflecting back the emptiness of the hour. He paused for a moment before entering, aware that the case, though nearing its legal conclusion, would never truly end. Not for the mother who mourned, nor for the women who recognized in Irene's fate the echo of their own narrow escapes. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light, the sea continued its tireless rhythm, erasing, reshaping, indifferent. The same tide that had once hidden her body now covered the traces of a society reluctant to see itself. By the time winter settled over Sussex, the story of the Crumbles murder had hardened into legend. The newspapers no longer spoke of a girl from London or a seaside tragedy. They spoke of the case. It had become a kind of national theater, an emblem of moral decline, a warning about the perils of modernity, and, above all, a story with a beginning, a middle, and soon an end. When the Lewis Winter Assizes opened in December 1920, crowds began gathering outside the courthouse before dawn. Some had traveled from Eastbourne, others from London. They wanted to see the faces that had filled their imaginations for months, the faces of William Gray and Jack Field, now charged with the murder of Irene Violet Munro. Tickets for seats in the public gallery had been requested weeks in advance. For many, attendance was less an act of civic duty than a curiosity, a way to measure the line between virtue and ruin. The building itself was old and austere, its stone walls darkened by rain. Inside, the courtroom smelled of damp wood and tobacco. A coal fire hissed in the grate beneath the judge's bench, giving off more smoke than heat. The spectators filed in quietly, their footsteps muffled on the worn floorboards. At 10:30, the clerk called the court to order. Mr. Justice Avery, silver-haired and severe, presided. The prosecution was led by Charles Gill, an experienced barrister known for his precision. The defense had been arranged by a tabloid newspaper, an ethically dubious but not uncommon practice in those years. Sir Edward Marshall Hall, famed for his eloquence, represented Gray. Mr. John Castles, less seasoned, represented Field. The paper had agreed to pay their fees in exchange for the promise of exclusive interviews should either man confess. It was a bargain that reduced tragedy to commerce, but in 1920, public appetite for sensation had its own economy. When the prisoners were brought into the dock, a hush fell over the room. Field, thin and restless, kept his head low. Gray stood straight, his limp barely noticeable, his expression hard. Their contrasting demeanors, one cowed, one defiant, gave the audience an easy morality to cling to. The older man appeared the villain, the younger his corrupted follower. The charge was read aloud, that on the 19th day of August at Eastbourne they did feloniously, willfully, and of malice aforethought, kill and murder one Irene Violet Munro. Both pleaded not guilty. The prosecution began with the sequence of evidence. Chief Inspector Mercer took the stand first, his voice measured, his manner factual. He described the investigation from discovery to arrest, the witnesses who had seen Irene walking with two men, the painter's testimony, the sailor's account, the recovery of the blood-stained stone. He spoke without embellishment, yet every detail deepened the stillness in the room. Then came Dr. Ernest Cadman, describing the state of the body when found, the injuries, the likely time of death. The jurors listened, pale and motionless. When he spoke of the blow that had fractured the skull, several women in the gallery turned away. The doctor's tone remained clinical, but the imagery was inescapable. Next, the exhibits were brought forward. The green coat, the blue handbag still missing, the walking stick carved with a dog's head, and the stone, each labeled, each wrapped in brown paper. The clerk laid them carefully on the table before the jury. The sight of these ordinary objects stripped of context seemed to unsettle everyone. They were not merely props in a story, they were fragments of reality, evidence that cruelty had weight and texture. Witnesses followed in steady procession. The painters confirmed seeing Irene with the two accused. The sailor, William Putland, and the ex-soldier, Fred Wells, gave matching accounts of her offering sweets from a paper bag. Their voices carried the simple authority of ordinary men with no reason to lie. The most chilling testimony came from a prison inmate named Archibald Darrington, who had recently been convicted of bicycle theft. He recounted how, while in custody, Gray had approached him, asking about his whereabouts on the day of the murder. When Darrington mentioned the circus, Gray urged him to say he had been there with him. Later, Gray suggested he tell police he had seen a sailor struggling with a girl on the Crumbles, even naming the man he hoped to frame. The implication was unmistakable, an attempt to fabricate an alibi and shift blame. Another prisoner, Bill Smith, testified that Gray had described dropping a big stone on the victim. The courtroom grew still as he spoke. Though defense counsel attacked his credibility, the detail aligned too closely with the medical evidence to be ignored. Field's defense depended on youth and fear. His lawyer portrayed him as a weak boy led astray by an older man. Gray's defense, in turn, argued that Field had acted alone. Each tried to outdistance the other, their denials colliding like reflections in a cracked mirror. When Field took the stand, he spoke softly, denying everything. "I never met her," he said. "I was in town that day, not near the beach." But under cross-examination, his answers faltered. He admitted knowing Gray, admitted owning the stick, admitted being short of money before the murder and flush afterward. The jury watched him struggle with his own contradictions, the color rising in his face. Gray refused to testify. His silence, though legally permissible, weighed heavily against him. Jurors, unused to restraint from men accused of their lives, interpreted quiet as contempt. Outside the courthouse, crowds waited for news, reading the afternoon editions as they arrived by train. The headlines grew more dramatic with each hour. Crumbles murder, sensational prison testimony, girl's death reconstructed in court. The language of journalism turned evidence into theater, eroding whatever privacy remained to the dead. Inside, Mr. Justice Avery maintained strict decorum. At one point, during the doctor's graphic description of injuries, he ordered all female spectators to leave the courtroom. "This is not matter for women's ears," he said. The irony escaped him. The same society that refused women access to truth had also refused them protection from the violence that made it necessary. The prosecution closed with quiet certainty. "There is no mystery here," Gill said. "The facts are as plain as the shore itself. These men sought amusement and found opportunity. When the girl resisted, they killed her. The evidence is not of planning, but of impulse, the kind born of moral decay." The defense replied with appeals to emotion. Marshall Hall spoke eloquently of Gray's war service, of the scars that had never healed. "Are we to hang a man who is himself a victim of war?" he asked, his voice trembling. It was a performance, and the jury knew it, but it left an impression. Castles, for Field, argued that his client was a foolish youth, guilty perhaps of weakness but not of murder. The judge's summing up was brief. He reminded the jury that sympathy must not cloud judgment, that speculation was not evidence, and that their task was to weigh facts, not stories. Yet in truth, facts alone rarely decide such cases. Beneath every verdict lies the weight of collective feeling, the need for closure, for reassurance that chaos can be contained. The jury retired at dusk. Through the courthouse windows, the light faded into the cold blue of December evening. Outside, the crowd murmured in the darkness. After 70 minutes, the bell rang. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of murder, with a recommendation to mercy on account of the crime's non-premeditated nature. The words hung in the air. Field wept. Gray did not move. The judge adjusted his spectacles, his expression grave but not unkind. "You have been found guilty of the willful murder of a young woman whose life was known to none of you, yet whose death has stained this nation's conscience. The sentence of the court is that you be taken from hence to a place of lawful execution and there hang by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy upon your souls." The gavel struck once. The sound, flat and final, echoed through the chamber. Outside, the crowd dispersed slowly, subdued now that the spectacle had concluded. The rain began to fall, thin and cold. A boy selling newspapers shouted the evening headline into the wind: "Crumbles killers sentenced to hang." In his report that night, Mercer wrote only a few lines. Case concluded. Verdict expected. No irregularities. He closed the file and sat in silence for a long time before extinguishing the lamp. Justice had been done, but justice, he knew, was only one form of order. It could restore process, not peace. Somewhere beyond the courthouse, the sea moved unseen, its waves carrying the same cold rhythm as before. It would erase the footprints, the headlines, even the names in time. But the silence it left behind would be the true verdict, unwritten, unappealed, and endless. In the cold dawn of December 23, 1920, the sound of the prison bell at Maidstone Jail marked another day subtracted from 2 men's lives. The verdict had been delivered, the formal petitions had begun, and the machinery of execution, slow, bureaucratic, merciless, had already started its familiar rhythm. The warders called it the waiting season. It was the period between sentence and hanging, a fortnight of subdued ritual. The condemned men were kept apart from the general population, their cells cleaner, their meals slightly better, their names written in chalk outside the doors. The chaplain visited daily. The hangman, when finally summoned, would arrive without announcement, blending quietly into the routine until the final morning. For William Gray and Jack Field, time ceased to measure progress. It thickened instead, turning into an airless repetition of prayers, cigarettes, and memories. Each hour was an imitation of the one before it. They were locked in adjacent cells but forbidden to speak. The walls between them carried their silence more powerfully than words ever had. The trial's conclusion had stripped them of individuality. In the eyes of the world, they were no longer men but verdicts. The Crumbles murderers. The newspapers printed their portraits again, this time bordered in black. Editorials praised the justice system for its swift and righteous action. The public, sated by the drama of the court, turned its attention toward Christmas. The spectacle was over. The punishment could proceed quietly without audience. Yet inside the prison, the human residue of the case refused to fade. The chaplain, Reverend Samuel Cope, noted in his diary that Gray remained self-contained, bitter, and without visible remorse. He refused communion, refused confession. "I am not afraid of the rope," he told the chaplain once. "I have faced worse things than that." His pride was his only remaining possession, and he guarded it with the same ferocity that had once made him dangerous. Field, by contrast, disintegrated quickly. He was 19, thin as a reed, and ill-equipped for solitude. He wept often, slept poorly, and clung to fragments of denial. "It wasn't me," he repeated to the guards, though he no longer expected them to believe it. Sometimes he spoke of his mother, sometimes of Irene. One night he told the chaplain, "I dream of her standing on the beach. She isn't angry. She's just looking at me." The words unsettled Cope more than any confession could have. In his official correspondence, Chief Inspector Mercer described the men's condition without sentiment. Gray remains unrepentant, Field nervous and changeable, execution likely to proceed without incident. But privately, he felt a weariness that no verdict could alleviate. The law, he knew, required its rituals of conclusion, but closure was a fiction. The dead did not return, and the living did not forget. Justice was an instrument, not a salve. Meanwhile, outside the prison, the campaign for clemency began in its usual, futile form. Petitions circulated in London and Eastbourne, signed by those who believed the youth of one defendant or the war service of the other merited mercy. Ministers received polite letters, drafted in careful handwriting, appealing to compassion. The Home Secretary, after reviewing the evidence, declined to intervene. His reply, copied into the official record, was brief: "The law must take its course." The phrase had the simplicity of a machine, and like a machine, it functioned without emotion. As the year drew to its close, the weather turned severe. Snow fell over Kent, whitening the prison roofs and muffling the usual sounds of mourning. In the condemned block, the chill seeped through the thick walls, though the warders kept the small stoves burning. The air smelled of coal, damp wool, and disinfectant. Gray spent his hours pacing. He had requested books, but read none of them. He stood often at the narrow window, gazing toward a sky too high to offer comfort. He spoke once to the chaplain about the war, not the battles, but the return. "They gave us medals," he said, "and told us to be good citizens. But what do you do with hands that only learned how to kill?" It was not self-pity. It was recognition. For a moment, the chaplain almost pitied him. Field grew quieter with each passing day. The prison doctor noted mental deterioration, alternating fits of panic and apathy. He refused meals, then devoured them. He asked for paper and tried to write a letter to his mother, but abandoned it halfway through. On New Year's Eve, he asked the guard if people outside were celebrating. When the guard nodded, he said, "It must be nice to hear music." In Eastbourne, that night, the sea was calm. The town had long since resumed its seasonal routine. The promenade lights shimmered faintly through the fog. Only those who lived near the Crumbles felt the quiet differently. They said that when the wind came from the west, it carried a sound like whispering. The rational dismissed it as superstition. The rest called it memory. On February 3, 1921, the formal notice was read to the prisoners. The execution would take place the following morning. They received the news without protest. Field fainted briefly. Gray merely nodded. The chaplain sat with them in turns through the night. The hangman, Thomas Pierrepoint, arrived after midnight, accompanied by his assistant. They were professionals, known for their precision, their discretion, and their silence. In those last hours, time condensed. The bells rang for 6 o'clock, then 7. Outside the prison walls, the snow had turned to slush, gray underfoot. Inside, the air was still. At 8 minutes past 9 on Friday, February 4th, the two men were led separately to the scaffold. Gray walked first, erect, his hands steady. He declined the chaplain's final words. Field followed moments later, trembling. The witnesses described him as pale and incoherent, repeating, "I didn't do it," until the hood descended. The trapdoor fell twice in quick succession. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The warders recorded the time, the doctor signed the certificate, and the bodies were buried in unmarked graves within the prison grounds, as the law required. No service, no flowers, no names. The press reported the event in restrained tones, perhaps out of fatigue. Crumbles murderers executed, sentence carried out at Maidstone. The accompanying columns were brief, almost perfunctory. There was no longer any appetite for drama. The story had consumed itself. Flora Munro read the notice in the Morning Post while sitting at her kitchen table. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer. There were no words she could have spoken that would have altered the moment. Her daughter was not avenged. She was simply gone. For Mercer, the case closed quietly. He filed his final report, noting the execution without comment, and returned to his other duties. But at night, he found himself thinking of the Crumbles, the wind over the shingle, the way the sea erased everything. He wondered whether the law's finality had meaning, or whether it merely provided shape to what human reason could not bear to leave undefined. The winter passed into spring. Grass grew over the graves at Maidstone, over the stones at the beach, over the year itself. People forgot, as people must. The Crumbles would, in time, become a place of houses and gardens. Yet beneath the surface, the old earth held its memory, the weight of violence, the echo of footsteps, the stillness after the storm. In his notebook, Mercer once wrote a line he never published. Every murder is the mirror of its age. It was not cynicism, but observation. The killing of Irene Munro had revealed not merely two men's brutality, but a society's blindness, its indulgence toward male cruelty, its indifference to female vulnerability, its need to tidy horror into order. The trial had ended, but the conditions that produced it had not. At the edge of the coast, the sea continued its patient erosion. Each wave removed another fragment of the past, only to replace it with something identical. To the wind, all stories were the same: rise, fall, silence. When the bells of Maidstone ceased their tolling, the world outside barely stirred. The executions had been swift, without spectacle, attended only by officials and a handful of reporters. Within hours, the prison resumed its routine. Doors clanged, floors were scrubbed, and the wards filled again with the ordinary noise of custody. To those who lived and worked there, 2 deaths were merely procedure fulfilled. Beyond those walls, the story of the Crumbles faded with startling speed. The morning papers gave it 1 column. By evening, another scandal had already taken its place. A political quarrel in Westminster, a railway accident, a society wedding. The appetite for horror had been sated. The public turned away. The dead, as always, were left to their silence. Yet memory, unlike news, obeys no schedule. It lingers where it is least welcome. In the mind of the investigator, the conscience of the town, the heart of a mother. Flora Munro, back in London, continued her work quietly. The families she served avoided the subject of her daughter. Kindness often disguises itself as avoidance. She said little in return. Her grief had become a discipline. Private, methodical, almost impersonal. She rose early, polished silver, ironed linen, and wrote no more letters. The photograph of Irene, once framed on the mantel, was now kept in a drawer. She could not bear to look at it, nor to remove it entirely. Sometimes, when she walked through the city, she caught sight of young women who reminded her of Irene. The same dark hair, the same purposeful stride. They seemed to belong to a newer, freer age, unafraid to travel alone or laugh in public. She felt both pride and fear watching them. The world her daughter had tried to inhabit was still forming, uncertain and unprotected. The newspapers had defined Irene by her innocence. Flora understood her instead by her longing. She had not been reckless, only hopeful. That distinction, invisible to editors and judges, was the essence of her life. But hope, in that era, was a fragile luxury. In Eastbourne, the town returned to its polite monotony. The bandstand reopened for spring, the hotels repainted their facades, and visitors arrived as before. Yet for those who lived near the Crumbles, something had changed in the air. The place carried a weight it had never borne before, not of haunting exactly, but of recognition. Children were warned not to stray there. Couples avoided it at dusk. A few locals claimed to sense a presence on the shingle, a feeling of unease when the wind shifted. Such stories grew in the telling. They were not about ghosts, but about conscience. The way a community remembers what it would rather forget. Chief Inspector Mercer returned to Eastbourne once, in the spring of 1921, to close the administrative files. He walked again along the path that led to the sea, the same route Irene had taken on her final afternoon. The grass had grown back, the sand shifted. Nothing remained of the investigation but a few paper records locked in a drawer at Scotland Yard. He had spent 20 years solving crimes, but this one had altered something in him. Not through its brutality, there had been worse, but through its ordinariness. Everything about it had been avoidable. The town had known Gray's nature and ignored it. The constables had laughed at the complaints. The newspapers had turned cruelty into romance. The system had functioned perfectly and failed completely. Standing there on the edge of the Crumbles, Mercer realized that justice was not the opposite of tragedy. It was simply its conclusion. The gallows closed the story, but the wound it revealed remained open, invisible, and enduring. The Crumbles themselves were changing. Developers had begun surveying the area, seeing opportunity in the open land. By the 1930s, the first houses would appear, neat terraces built upon the sand and shingle. Streets would take the place of dunes. Gardens would replace the sparse grass where Irene had once walked. Progress, in its efficient way, would bury memory beneath foundations. But not yet. In 1921, the place was still barren, a strip of wind-beaten coast where only the tide moved with purpose. The waves came and went with mechanical rhythm, as if measuring the passage of guilt itself. Mercer lingered there a long time before turning back. Elsewhere, the echoes of the case continued in quieter forms. In Parliament, a brief debate arose about the treatment of returning soldiers and the supervision of men discharged from service with mental injuries. The discussion ended without policy. In the courts, other cases of violence against women were tried, described as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of pattern. The newspapers still framed morality as entertainment, alternating between admiration for modern freedom and nostalgia for restraint. The Crumbles murder, as it was now permanently labeled, had joined the archive of public cautionary tales. It was recited in drawing rooms as a warning to daughters, dramatized in cheap periodicals, and even adapted into a short pulp novel where the heroine's purity was her defining trait. Fiction simplified what reality could not contain. In the small space of an urban lodging, Flora grew older. The war memorial near her street carried the names of young men who had died before their time. Her daughter's name was nowhere among them, though her life had been another casualty of the same age. Some evenings, she lit a candle near the window, not from superstition, but to watch the flame tremble. It was the only movement in a room otherwise too still. Years passed. The press forgot. Eastbourne expanded. The Crumbles slowly vanished beneath concrete. By the 1960s, few residents could have pointed to the exact spot where the body had been found. The past became geography, faint outlines on old maps, known only to archivists and the occasional historian. But memory, like the sea, leaves traces long after the surface has been smoothed. Even when its shape is gone, its pressure remains. If one walks the modern streets built over that ground, through the housing estates and small parks, past the ordinary fences and washing lines, one still hears, in the right weather, the whisper of wind through shingle that no longer exists. The air carries salt, and with it, something unnamed. Mercer, retired by then, would never return. He died quietly in 1938, his papers destroyed except for one notebook found among his belongings. In it, a single line survived beneath the heading, Crumbles Case. She was not the first, nor the last, but for a moment the world saw her, and in seeing, looked away. Flora outlived him by another decade. She died in 1949, aged 71, still working part-time as a domestic servant. In her effects, the only personal item recorded was a small photograph of a young woman, seated, turning slightly toward the light. On the back, in faded pencil, she had written, "Irene, my girl." No memorial was ever erected for her daughter. The grave in Eastbourne Cemetery lies unmarked among others of its time. The entry in the burial register lists her simply as Munro Irene Violet, domestic clerk, aged 17. It does not mention the manner of her death, nor the noise it once made. But history has a way of resurfacing. In later decades, when another murder occurred on the same stretch of beach, journalists revived the name Crumbles. The earlier case returned as a prelude, its details reassembled from yellowed archives. Each retelling was less about Irene herself than about what the past demanded to remember: the illusion of safety, the persistence of danger, the fragile architecture of decency. The sea, indifferent, continued its endless conversation with the shore. At high tide, the water reached the same invisible line it had crossed a century earlier, as if rehearsing the same gesture of concealment and revelation. The land was different, but the rhythm was the same. To walk there now is to step on both present and absence, on earth that is forgotten and on memory that refuses to die. The sound of waves meeting stones is indistinguishable from the sound of breath. In that merging lies the true legacy of the Crumbles, not the violence itself, but the silence that followed and the uneasy peace that silence demands. 4 years after the murder of Irene Munro, the Crumbles once again entered the newspapers. The headlines carried a familiar rhythm: "Murder on the Eastbourne shore," as though history itself had found a script it refused to abandon. To those who remembered 1920, the repetition was unbearable. To those too young or new to the town, it was simply another sensation, another reminder that even the most respectable landscapes can turn traitorous. It was May 1924 when the second body was found. The victim was Emily Bealby Kay, a 35-year-old secretary from London, intelligent, self-sufficient, and, like Irene before her, seeking respite by the sea. Her killer was Patrick Herbert Mahon, a married man and a fraudster who had seduced her with promises of love and escape. Their liaison had begun in secrecy and ended in the same desolate stretch of coast that had once swallowed Irene's laughter. The newspapers quickly coined a new name for the place: the Crumbles Horror. The phrase was designed to sell, but beneath it lingered the echo of the earlier tragedy: the same geography, the same motif of betrayal, the same slow exposure of a body hidden among the stones. For Eastbourne, it was not merely a crime, it was a haunting. By then, much of the landscape had changed. Developers had built rows of new houses near the shoreline. The scrubland where Irene had been found was being reshaped into roads and allotments. The Crumbles themselves, those wide shifting banks of shingle, remained only at the outer edge, a remnant of wilderness that still resisted domestication. Yet it was here, among the same winds and tides, that Emily Kay met her end. Her story differed in detail, but not in essence. Like Irene, she had believed herself safe. Like Irene, she had trusted a man whose confidence masked cruelty. Mahon, older and charming, had promised her a new life abroad. Instead, he led her to a rented bungalow near the beach, killed her in a quarrel, and attempted to destroy her remains. His methods were more elaborate than Gray and Field's blunt brutality, but the impulse was identical: the desire to assert ownership over another life. The police who investigated Mahon's crime could not help recalling the earlier case. Some of them had been young constables in 1920. Others had grown up hearing their parents speak of the girl in the green coat. The connection was immediate, instinctive. The Crumbles once again became a synonym for violation. In London, when the story broke, Flora Munro was still alive. She was in her late 60s, frail but lucid. She read the headline in the evening paper and set it aside without finishing. The words "Crumbles" and "murder" together were enough. For a moment she felt as though time had folded inward, that her daughter's death had not been conclusion but prelude, the same setting, the same indifference, the same failure to learn. She said nothing to her employer, who noticed her silence but did not ask why. Grief, by then, had become an old garment she wore without explanation. The nation followed the Mahon trial with morbid fascination. It was the first major murder case to be reported in what was becoming the modern tabloid style. Photographs, diagrams, serialized reconstructions. The forensic work was meticulous, the evidence grotesque. When the verdict came, guilty and condemned, the public felt not only horror but déjà vu. The Crumbles had claimed another life. And once again, the machinery of justice moved as if repeating itself from memory. The difference, however, lay in the response. The murder of Emily Kay, coming after a decade of social change, provoked questions that Irene's death had not. Psychologists began to speak of moral derangement rather than inherent evil. The newspapers discussed mental illness, shell shock, and the lingering scars of war. For the first time, the public confronted the idea that violence was not an isolated vice, but a symptom of broader unrest. And yet, Even in this supposed enlightenment, gender remained the quiet center of the story. The victim's respectability was dissected as carefully as the evidence. Reporters described her clothing, her habits, her letters, as though character could determine whether suffering was deserved. The pattern persisted. The woman's life examined for fault, the man's for explanation. To the people of Eastbourne, the repetition was unbearable. The town council debated whether the name Crumbles itself should be removed from maps, as if words could cleanse memory. Some suggested fencing off the area, others proposed a new development to civilize the landscape. Within a few years, both ideas would come to pass. Houses rose, roads were paved, and the shoreline was tamed into something ordinary. But place remembers what people forget. The sea erases, but it also reveals. Each wave that struck the shore carried, in some molecular way, the remnants of both stories. The two women separated by years but joined by circumstance. Chief Inspector Mercer did not live to see the second crime. He had retired in 1926, a quiet man with failing eyesight, and died 2 years later. Among his papers destroyed after his death, the Crumbles file was missing. Some believed he had burned it himself. Perhaps he understood that the archive of violence is never truly closed, that to preserve it is to invite its return. For the new generation of detectives, the Mahon case became a study in modern forensics, a demonstration of how science could expose the invisible. Yet what it could not expose was motive in its truest form, the slow corrosion of empathy that allows one person to treat another as expendable. That corrosion had not been cured by progress. It had merely evolved. By the mid-1930s, the Crumbles had been built over entirely. The open shingle gave way to suburban lawns, the sound of waves replaced by the hum of motor cars. The residents who moved into those new homes knew little of what had happened beneath their gardens. A few older neighbors told them, in lowered voices, about the girls and the men who were hanged. The stories sounded like folklore, cautionary, distant, unreal. Yet every so often something would disturb the quiet. A newspaper anniversary article, a historian's essay, a passing reference in a murder trial elsewhere. Each mention revived, however briefly, the uneasy knowledge that the past never truly ends. It waits. For those who had lived through both cases, the repetition felt like accusation. It was not simply that two murders had occurred in the same place. It was that the same conditions had allowed them: indifference, exploitation, the moral double standard that judged women for trusting and excused men for betraying. The Crumbles was not cursed ground. It was honest ground, revealing without mercy the truth beneath social order. Flora did not live to see the houses rise. She died in 1949, as the modern world was emerging from another war, another cycle of violence. Her death passed unnoticed beyond a brief notice in the parish register. The generation that had known her daughter was nearly gone. But still the stories persisted, retold by those who found comfort in their repetition. Today, the Crumbles survives only as a word, attached to a retail park and a line on an old map. Yet the tide, indifferent to human renaming, still moves to the same ancient rhythm. Beneath the soil and foundations, the sand remembers. And when the wind blows in from the channel, carrying the salt and the faint metallic tang of seaweed, it carries also the echo of footsteps on shingle, the sound of two lives lost to the same blindness. Each generation believes itself immune to repetition. Each discovers too late that history is patient, and in that patience lies the real terror, not the violence itself, but its predictability. The years after the second Crumbles murder unfolded like a long exhalation, a nation settling uneasily into the rhythm of forgetting. The decade that had begun with shock and headlines ended with silence. People grew older, the world changed, and the details of what had once seemed unbearable blurred into fragments, softened by distance. Only the name remained, detached from memory yet still faintly ominous: the Crumbles. By the late 1920s, the landscape itself was almost unrecognizable. The empty expanse of shingle had given way to cranes and brick dust. A housing estate rose where the marshland had been, its streets named for trees and virtues: Elm Road, Oak Avenue, Hope Crescent, as though language could consecrate the ground it covered. Builders unearthed nothing but shells and sand, though a few swore they felt something unsettled beneath the foundations, a tremor that vanished as soon as it was noticed. The town planners called it progress. Eastbourne, once a genteel resort for the upper middle class, was becoming a model of suburban growth. The sea was no longer wild but domesticated by piers, promenades, and neat rows of chalets. Respectability had triumphed over wilderness, yet progress has its own form of amnesia. In taming the landscape, it forgets the cost of peace. In newspapers, the Crumbles appeared only in footnotes, brief references and retrospectives about criminal history or the advancement of forensic science. The names Gray, Field, Munro, and later Mahan and Kay resurfaced occasionally in crime anthologies, but even these accounts were distorted, reduced to narrative formula. The victims became archetypes, the killers, curiosities. Each retelling flattened the texture of real lives into moral allegory. For those who had lived through the original events, the fading of public memory brought mixed relief. To forget was to heal, but also to lose meaning. Flora Monroe did not live long enough to see the world forget her daughter entirely, but the process had already begun before her death in 1949. The new generation spoke of the 1920s as a distant era, quaint, naive, defined by flappers and jazz rather than hardship and loss. The Great Depression had rewritten the nation's priorities. Hunger replaced morality as the defining anxiety. The criminal became less a figure of fear than of desperation. Violence, once interpreted as moral collapse, was now understood as social failure. In this shift, the memory of the Crumbles murders found no place. They belonged to an older moral universe, one in which virtue and vice still served as explanations for everything. And then came another war. In 1939, the sirens of the Second World War swept away whatever remnants of that earlier decade remained. The bombings, the rationing, the sudden dislocation of life, all of it erased the smaller horrors that had preceded them. Compared to the scale of global death, a single seaside murder seemed almost trivial. The past was folded neatly into archives, its significance diminished by proportion. Yet history has its quiet persistence. When the blackout fell over Eastbourne and the coast was patrolled by soldiers once again, a few older residents whispered that the darkness felt familiar. The same wind, the same sense of exposure, the same fear of what moved unseen along the shore. The town was shelled several times during the war, and one of those shells landed near the very ground where Irene had been found. It destroyed part of the housing estate, but spared the rest. Afterward, no one rebuilt that particular section. Superstition, though unspoken, guided the decision. After 1945, Britain remade itself once more. The war had democratized suffering. Grief was now a collective condition rather than a private shame. The welfare state rose from the ashes of bombed streets, promising fairness where fate had once ruled. But progress, again, demanded erasure. The new world wanted clean beginnings, not the residue of old sins. The Crumbles disappeared entirely from public conversation. By the 1950s, its name survived only in small talk. A half-remembered caution, a reference exchanged among the elderly. A child asking why an empty field remained undeveloped might hear, "That's the Crumbles, love. Best not go there." No explanation followed. The memory had become instinct. Academics in the 1960s began to rediscover the case, drawn by its historical texture rather than its tragedy. They described it as an early example of the intersection between class, gender, and criminal justice, though those terms would not have existed in 1920. One sociologist wrote that the Munro and Kay murders mark the transition between Victorian repression and modern exposure. It was true in theory, if cold in tone. To scholars, the victims were data points. To time itself, they were shadows. What remained, quietly enduring, was the geography of harm. The Crumbles had been built over, yet it still resisted complete assimilation. The soil shifted unpredictably. The roads there required constant repair. Residents spoke of an unease they could not name, a discomfort at dusk when the sea wind rose, a silence between houses that seemed too deliberate. Superstition, the most primitive form of remembrance, had preserved what history forgot. In these forgotten years, the idea of the woman alone became central to Britain's imagination. The post-war decades celebrated independence for women, employment, travel, education, yet always with a hint of caution. The lingering fear of vulnerability, the inherited anxiety of women like Flora, persisted beneath the language of progress. Every generation taught its daughters caution disguised as wisdom. Be careful, they said. Don't talk to strangers. Behind those words lay the ghost of Irene Munro. In London, television began to transform the way stories were told. Crime, once confined to newspapers, became entertainment. Reenactments, radio dramas, and later documentaries turned tragedy into narrative currency. The Crumbles murders resurfaced briefly in this new format, mentioned in passing on programs about infamous British crimes. Viewers watched with detached curiosity. The faces were now sketches, the places unfamiliar. The audience did not flinch. By the 1970s, Eastbourne had become a retirement town. The past felt distant even to those who lived above it. The houses that lined the former Crumbles were tidy and unremarkable, their gardens trimmed, their occupants polite. Children cycled where Irene had once walked. The memory of violence was buried so deeply that it felt almost impossible to retrieve. But memory never dies. It simply changes form. It seeps into geography, into gesture, into the faint reluctance of a local to linger by the sea after dark. The Crumbles, once a physical place, had become psychological terrain, the space between safety and its loss. For the historian who visits Eastbourne now, little remains of that earlier world. The pier still stands, though restored. The promenade hums with life in summer. Yet beneath the comfort of familiarity lies an invisible archive, older than the buildings, older than memory itself. The town's very air seems to carry it, that strange mingling of refinement and denial, beauty and cruelty. Every generation rebuilds upon its ruins, and every so often, in the quiet between tides, the wind still carries the echo of a name, almost forgotten but not erased. Irene. She endures not because history demands it, but because silence cannot hold forever. In that endurance lies the shape of the forgotten years, the calm surface of a country that learned, again and again, to forget what it could not forgive. For half a century, the Crumbles lay buried beneath the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Houses stood where shingle once shifted, the gardens neat and identical. The past, it seemed, had been tamed at last. Yet history, like the tide, has a habit of returning when the world grows complacent. All it requires is the faintest disturbance, a name, a rumor, a curiosity passed from one generation to another, to awaken what has slept. It began, as many resurrections do, in an archive. In the late 1960s, a young local historian named Jeffrey Hollis was researching early 20th century crime for a county publication. While combing through microfilm newspapers in a dim reading room, he stumbled across a headline: "Girl Murdered at Eastbourne. Body Found on the Crumbles." The accompanying article, blurred and brittle, contained the first account of Irene Munro's death. The name was unfamiliar. The place, too, seemed abstract. Hollis had grown up in Eastbourne, but to him the Crumbles was merely a suburban district, a sprawl of new housing and a retail strip. He read on. The more he uncovered, the stranger it felt. The proximity of tragedy to the familiar, the way an entire story could vanish from collective knowledge. He copied the clippings, made notes, and began to trace the official record, the inquest, the trial, the executions. What he found disturbed him less for its brutality than for its absence from memory. How, he wondered, could a crime that had once filled every front page have disappeared so completely from local consciousness? His short essay, published in 1971 in the Sussex Historical Journal, was dry in tone but quietly revelatory. It listed the principal dates, the names of the accused, and the verdict. It ended with a question. What does it mean when a town forgets its own dead? The question drew little notice at first, but in the decades that followed, it would become central to the rediscovery of the case. By the 1980s, Britain was in the midst of a new fascination with its darker past. Television had turned history into spectacle, and crime, once whispered about in moral terms, was now recast as cultural heritage. Producers sought stories that combined period detail with psychological insight, and the Crumbles murders offered both. They represented not just violence, but the social transformation of an era, the collision between propriety and modernity, innocence and desire, authority and neglect. Documentaries appeared, each repeating the same grainy photographs: the blurred image of Irene, the mugshots of Gray and Field, the empty sweep of beach. Narrators spoke in measured tones about the moral tensions of post-war Britain. The language had changed, the moral unease had not. For local residents, the renewed attention was unsettling. Many had no idea that their home stood upon the ground once known as the Crumbles. Letters appeared in newspapers from readers expressing disbelief. Surely not the same place. Others wrote of family memories. A grandmother who had warned them never to walk there alone. An uncle who claimed to have seen the police search the shingle. The private myths of the town began to merge again with public record. In Eastbourne's small museum, a temporary exhibition was assembled using surviving artifacts: a replica of Irene's green coat, photographs of the trial, and the walking stick carved with a dog's head. Visitors came hesitantly, their expressions subdued. The curator described the display as an act of recognition. It was not morbid, he said. It was historical. Yet even history, when it involves the dead, carries an echo of prayer. Among the new generation of historians, the Crumbles case became a lens through which to view the larger structures of its time. Feminist scholars examined the treatment of Irene and Emily Kay by the press, how both had been scrutinized for their behavior more than their suffering. Others analyzed the social machinery of policing, the hierarchy of moral judgment, and the persistence of class prejudice in early 20th century Britain. What had once been a single event was now seen as the symptom of a system. And yet, beyond the language of theory and scholarship, the story retained its human gravity. It drew attention not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. A mirror reflecting the everyday dangers of trust and the quiet cruelty of indifference. By the 1990s, local historians organized guided walks along the modern shoreline, tracing where the Crumbles had once stretched. They stood at the edge of housing estates, pointing toward the invisible sea line, explaining how the geography had shifted. Visitors listened in silence. The sound of waves reached them faintly, filtered through distance and new construction. It was a different coast, yet somehow the same. For those who walked there, the realization was unsettling. The idea that the ground beneath them contained the unmarked graves of memory itself. They returned to their cars and their modern lives, carrying a faint unease, a sense that history is never truly past, only buried under habit. The 21st century brought further rediscovery. True crime podcasts and online archives revived forgotten cases, their calm narrators recounting the details once again. The letter Irene wrote to her mother, the painters who saw her walking with the two men, the verdict that sealed her fate. Each retelling reached new listeners who reacted with the same astonishment that Hollis had felt decades earlier. Why did no one know this? They asked. The question echoed across forums and comment sections, answered only by silence. Memory, once broken, does not return intact. It comes back altered, refracted through the concerns of its new age. Listeners of today hear Irene's story not as moral caution but as social parable, a commentary on power, gender, and empathy. They do not condemn her for traveling alone. They grieve that she could not have done so safely. The shift is subtle but profound. In Eastbourne, little remains of the physical landscape that shaped the case. The Crumbles is now a district of shops and quiet roads. Yet those who pause to listen, on certain evenings when the tide recedes and the wind crosses the flats, speak of a faint resonance in the air, a hum that might be the sea or something beneath it. A century is a long time for silence, but not long enough for forgetting. The return of memory has not brought resolution. It has brought awareness. The realization that every generation must decide what it is willing to remember and what it chooses to bury. The story of Irene Munro is no longer about guilt or innocence, but about recognition. The understanding that beneath every comfortable surface lies a forgotten truth, waiting for its voice. When modern historians speak of the Crumbles legacy, they refer not to the crime itself, but to the act of remembrance, the fragile bridge between past and conscience. It is the recognition that memory, once restored, demands responsibility. To recall Irene is to confront the society that failed her, and by extension, the patterns that persist still. Time, like the sea, repeats its motions. The waves that erase also return, and each generation standing on the same shore must decide whether to listen to what the tide is saying. A century has passed since Irene Munro stepped from the train into the August light of Eastbourne, her coat buttoned neatly, her heart open to the possibilities of the world. The town she entered is gone. The station is modern, the streets unrecognizable, the air filled with the hum of engines instead of the whistle of steam. Yet the distance between her time and ours is not as vast as the calendar suggests. Time changes scenery more easily than it changes instinct. Today, the Crumbles no longer exists as a landscape. It has been replaced by a sprawl of housing estates, retail warehouses, and car parks. The wind still comes in from the channel, but the shingle has been buried under asphalt and concrete. Where once there was emptiness, there is now order. Where once a young woman vanished, families push shopping trolleys and check their watches. It is easy to believe that history has been erased, but memory does not vanish when covered. It seeps upward through the cracks. It lives in the names of streets, in the faint reluctance of locals to speak of certain places, in the archival boxes stored in municipal basements. It lives in the photographs of Irene, one formal, one casual, rescued from fading newsprint. It lives in the way each generation retells her story, reshaping it to fit its own unease. The modern listener hears her tale through headphones, perhaps on a train not unlike the one she took that summer morning. They hear the rhythm of the wheels, the voice of a narrator tracing each step to its conclusion, and they feel something between pity and recognition. The past seems far away, yet intimate. They imagine her handwriting, her hesitation before leaving London, her decision to go alone. It feels somehow possible still. That is the long view of history, the realization that the boundary between then and now is porous. The lives of the dead continue as questions within the living. In this long view, the Crumbles murders are not merely historical curiosities. They are coordinates on a map of social evolution, points marking the slow, uneven progress of empathy. The 1920s spoke of moral failure, the 1960s of pathology, the 2000s of gendered violence. Each era found in the same tragedy a reflection of its own anxieties. Yet beneath the changing vocabulary, the core remains the same, a young woman's trust met by cruelty, and a society slow to defend her. If there is meaning to be salvaged from such repetition, it lies not in the punishment of her killers — justice has long been served in the narrow legal sense — but in the widening of understanding that followed. The very act of remembering Irene today, of tracing her journey and her world, is a form of quiet reparation. It restores to her what the newspapers once took away: complexity, dignity, presence. Her death, though violent, belongs to the small history of ordinary people, those who are rarely commemorated yet whose lives form the texture of an age. Through her, we glimpse the world of the early 20th century in its contradictions, the promise of modern life shadowed by the persistence of old hierarchies, the optimism of youth constrained by the expectations of gender and class. Irene was neither saint nor rebel. She was simply alive, and that simple aliveness was enough to make her loss monumental. The Crumbles itself, that restless border between land and sea, became a kind of symbol for the instability of the age. It was a threshold between respectability and freedom, between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the unknowable. Its erasure under new construction mirrors the nation's own desire to conceal its unease beneath layers of progress. Yet no architecture is permanent. The ground remembers. Every tide that touches the coast, every gust of salt wind carries some trace of what has been. In the quiet of evening, if one stands near the modern shoreline and listens past the noise of traffic, one might still hear a sound not unlike breathing. The sea inhaling and exhaling against the stones that remain buried. It is not supernatural, it is continuity. For historians and storytellers alike, the Crumbles case endures because it resists finality. There is no closure, only perspective. The lives it contained, Irene's, Flora's, Gray's, Field's, Mercer's, form a constellation of human frailty, longing, fear, confusion, duty. None of them were extraordinary. All were shaped by circumstance. And that ordinariness, more than the crime itself, is what lingers. Flora's quiet endurance, the policeman's weary insight, the town's selective amnesia, together they tell a larger story about the limits of justice. Law can punish, but it cannot heal. Society can forget, but forgetting does not absolve. What remains is the slow work of understanding, a process that outlives generations. In recent years, the rediscovery of the case has found new audiences. Writers, archivists, and filmmakers revisit it not for sensation, but for empathy. They walk the same ground, read the same testimonies, and speak the same names aloud, as if repetition itself might grant peace. It does not. But it does remind us that history is not fixed. It breathes through those who engage with it, expanding slightly each time someone listens with care. The story of Irene Munro has no epilogue, only continuation. Every retelling becomes part of the chain of witnesses, not to the violence, but to the human capacity to confront it without turning away. Perhaps that is the quiet justice left to the dead, that their stories, once buried, continue to move through time, compelling reflection rather than fear. The long view reveals that tragedy, once examined without spectacle, becomes something else, a mirror held steady enough for us to see ourselves clearly. The fears that governed 1920 have not vanished. The precariousness of women's safety, the impulse to blame the vulnerable, the slow machinery of empathy. But awareness, unlike ignorance, does not fade. It accumulates. The Crumbles, both as place and symbol, stands as a reminder that every society builds over its discomforts. Yet beneath every foundation lies the sediment of consequence. The true work of remembrance is not to excavate endlessly, but to recognize the ground on which we stand, and to tread upon it with care. If you walk there today, you will see nothing unusual: pavements, streetlights, the pale sprawl of houses reaching toward the horizon. But when the wind rises and the sky lowers toward dusk, you might feel something like a tension, the faint awareness that the world is watching itself. It is not guilt. It is simply memory, patient and unresolved. And in that stillness, if one listens long enough, the voice of the sea speaks the same quiet truth it has whispered for 100 years, that every life once lost alters the shape of time itself, and that remembering is the gentlest form of justice.